Her fingers were already closed around the girl's jaw before she understood whose fingers they were. That morning, dressing for the party, she hadn't been thinking about jaws or slaps or anything else. She'd been thinking about her birthday, a couple of weeks off, and the rite of determination waiting at the church on the other side of it. And the attribute she already knew she'd draw: fire, like her father, red hair, like her father, the whole inherited package. Her maid had laid out a red dress that morning specifically so she'd stand out at today's gathering, and said as much while she pinned it. Charlotte hadn't argued. Standing out was the entire point of being a Fitzgerald. She'd arrived to a garden full of noble daughters who bowed and stepped back to clear her a path, the way people simply did when a Fitzgerald walked into a room. The Romeyer family had hosted this particular tea, and the butler had announced the venue as the garden the moment she stepped through the gate, as if she might have forgotten how to find it. She'd let herself enjoy the bowing for exactly as long as it lasted. It lasted until a girl with golden hair and wide blue eyes looked up at her without permission. Just a glance, barely a second, and something underneath Charlotte's own intentions, something that belonged to the body she was apparently wearing and not to her, had already decided how to answer that. "Who do you think you are?" The voice that came out of her mouth was entitled and sharp, a voice she didn't recognize as hers. "When did I say you could raise your head?" Her hand caught the girl's chin and wrenched her face up into the light before the sentence had even finished. "How dare you look at me so rudely?" The slap landed before the thought behind it had finished forming. The girl's head snapped sideways. Around them, a whole garden of teacups stopped halfway to a whole garden of lips. That was when the second thing woke up. It arrived the way cold water does. No warning, all at once. A tea party. A golden-haired girl. A slap over nothing that would end up mattering more than anything else that had ever happened to her. She had read this. She had turned this exact page, years and an entire life ago, half asleep on a bullet train, while her sister explained the plot of a novel called Reborn Again with You. The villainess in that novel had been named Charlotte Fitzgerald, and whatever fire attribute she'd spent the morning looking forward to, whatever birthday ceremony was still 2 months out, none of it mattered anymore. A girl who died in an explosion before the story ended didn't get to enjoy a magic ceremony first. The math on that was not complicated. Her hand was still closed on the girl's jaw. She was Charlotte Fitzgerald. More specifically, she was mid-slap, standing inside the exact scene where that villainess's story began falling apart. She remembered, with the useless, perfect clarity of a spoiler she'd never asked for, exactly how this character died. An explosion, right at the end of the book, the villainess screaming that she'd take everyone down with her on the way out. Her sister had delivered that detail on the train like a punchline. Sitting inside the girl's own hands right now, holding another child's face, it did not feel like a punchline at all. The golden-haired girl said nothing. She didn't have to. Charlotte already understood, with a dread that landed faster than the slap had, exactly whose face she was holding, because nobody in this story struck this particular girl and simply walked away from it afterward. Nobody except, apparently, the villainess who was scripted to burn for it. She let go of the chin. It was several seconds too late. Her father's voice cut across the garden before she even saw him move. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't ask who the girl was. He crossed the grass in 4 strides, and his palm caught Charlotte across the face hard enough to turn her head and buckle one knee under her. The world went white, then a ringing quiet, then the taste of copper. He didn't hit like a man who'd lost his temper. He hit like a man closing out a decision he'd already made, fast and clean, over before the garden had finished gasping the first time. Then, in the same breath, loud enough that every noble present would remember the moment exactly this way for years afterward, he announced who they were all looking at. The golden-haired girl kneeling in the grass, cheek reddening, silent, was Princess Flap. Charlotte's ears were still ringing. The name landed anyway. Flap, the heroine. The commoner girl the entire novel had been written to root for. The same girl the villainess spent 300 pages tormenting before dying in a fireball for it. Charlotte had just grabbed that exact girl's chin in front of 30 witnesses and struck her across the face for the crime of glancing upward. This wasn't background anymore. This was page 1, and she was standing inside it with her own cheek already swelling. The clock the book had promised, the one that ended in an explosion and a scream, had just started counting down in full view of everyone who mattered in the kingdom. Around her, no one moved to help. A few of the noble daughters had gone pale and stepped back, putting distance between themselves and whatever this was about to become. Nobody looked at Charlotte with anything close to sympathy. They looked at her the way people look at a building that has just been condemned. Her father didn't crouch down to check on her. He straightened his sleeve, said something cold, and clipped to the princess about the shame the family would answer for, called Charlotte a fool once, flatly, without heat, and turned back toward the house without looking down again at the daughter he'd left kneeling in the grass. Servants came out to collect the princess, murmuring apologies that weren't theirs to give, and walked her back toward the main house with the kind of careful attention nobody had spared Charlotte. Nobody offered Charlotte a hand up. She got to her own feet. Only once her father was gone did the panic in Charlotte's chest curdle into something flatter and considerably more useful. Fine, she thought. So she was going to die in an explosion, on a schedule set by a novel she'd read for entertainment on a train once, and nobody currently standing in this garden had bothered to ask her opinion on the matter. That was an insane way to spend however much time she had left. Somebody was allowed to have a problem with that. She decided the somebody was her. Nobody sent a doctor. Nobody sent anyone at all. She found a mirror and inspected the damage herself. One cheek swollen, a small cut at the corner of her mouth, red hair identical to the man who'd put both marks there. She cataloged the face looking back at her the way she'd once have read an inspection report, thorough and unemotional, looking only for what could actually be fixed tonight and what couldn't. The rest of it arrived the same way the face had, fully formed and uninvited. Not memories she'd lived so much as facts she now simply knew. Charlotte's mother had died when Charlotte was 6. A stepmother arrived within the year, pregnant not long after, with every reason in the world to want Charlotte gone, and no particular reason to be gentle about getting there. There had been an incident at another tea party once. At 5 years old, a girl who'd stared a moment too long, and something in 5-year-old Charlotte's temper that nobody in the room could explain had made the girl faint outright, dropping her fork mid-bite. Nobody had called it magic. Nobody had called it anything. It had simply gone into the file kept on this child, alongside everything else, as further proof she was difficult. None of that was new information to Charlotte the character. It was brand new to her. It also explained a few things nobody had bothered to say out loud tonight. Nobody had come to check on her, because nobody in this household currently had a reason to. The stepmother wanted an heir of her own, with no rival in the house. Her father had a princess to placate and a name to protect. A daughter who slapped royalty in public wasn't a problem to be comforted. She was a liability waiting to be dealt with, and dealt with quietly worked better for everyone left standing than dealt with kindly ever would. The habits were the harder problem. 8 years of getting what she wanted by demanding it loudly had built reflexes that didn't consult the new management. Twice that evening, washing the cut at her mouth with no maid sent to help her, she caught a sharp order half formed in her own throat before remembering there was nobody left in the room to snap it at. Both times, she had to physically stop her own mouth. Whatever else was uncertain tonight, that mouth had 8 years of muscle memory built into it, and retraining it was going to take considerably longer than one bad evening. She made herself think it through anyway, the way she'd once have prepared for a meeting she couldn't afford to walk into unready. Whatever her father wanted in the morning, it would not be an apology owed to her, and it would not be an invitation to argue. Her only real leverage was whatever came out of her own mouth in the next conversation, which meant, for possibly the first time in this body's life, she needed to walk in already knowing exactly what she wanted to ask for before he told her what she was allowed to have. Past midnight, a message came under the door. Her father wanted her in his office in the morning, a room she had never once, in 8 years, been permitted to enter. She read the note twice, then set it down. She already knew, with the flat certainty of someone rereading a book she'd finished once already, that whatever waited behind that door was not going to be a lecture. The office was smaller than she'd imagined, and colder. No fire had been lit despite the chill, which told her something about how long this conversation was expected to take. Her father stood behind the desk instead of sitting, which she understood immediately as a second message stacked on top of the first. This would not take nearly long enough to justify a chair. He didn't open with pleasantries. He looked at her, at the fading bruise still coloring her cheek, and asked, in that clipped, formal voice she was already learning to expect nothing warm from, whether she had finally found some remorse overnight, or whether he was about to get another display of the same nonsense that had already cost the family a princess's goodwill. Charlotte looked back at him and let the true thing out before pride could edit it. "I am truly sorry for my disrespect toward Her Highness the Princess. I wish to apologize." Her father went still. It wasn't a large reaction, a held breath, half a second where the paper in his hand stopped turning, but she caught it and understood. watching him recover, that in 8 years, this girl had never once apologized for anything and meant it, and that the apology had thrown him harder than his own hand had thrown her the day before. He recovered fast. Whatever ground the apology had bought her lasted exactly as long as it took him to remember why he'd summoned her in the first place. He set the paper down, squared it against the edge of the desk, and looked at her the way a man looks at a debt he's finally decided how to collect. He told her, without asking whether she wanted to hear it, that she was leaving the capital. She would be sent to the former Benburg territory, a ruined stretch of land the crown had spent years quietly trying to offload onto anyone foolish enough to take it, and she would govern it there as its lord, alone. No funds from the Fitzgerald house, no knights sent in Fitzgerald colors, no family name left to invoke if anything went wrong once she was out of his sight. He framed it with a perfectly straight face as mercy. She should be grateful, he said, that he was handing her a title and a chance to prove herself instead of surrendering her to whatever punishment the king decided fit a girl who had struck a princess in public. Exile, in his telling, was the generous option. The alternative, he implied without quite saying it, would not have left her with a face left to slap. Charlotte did the arithmetic while he was still talking. A girl of 8, sent alone to a territory bad enough that its last lord had abandoned it outright, with no money, no guard, and no name left that would open a single door on her behalf, was not leniency with better paperwork attached. It was a death sentence with a title stapled to it, arranged carefully enough that the family would never have to be in the room when it finished. She decided, standing there in the cold office, that panicking about that could wait until later. Negotiating about it could not. Then I have no choice, she said, but to beg for the charity of other houses. How many letters must I write, explaining to every noble house in the capital that the Fitzgerald name couldn't spare its own daughter a year's bread? His jaw tightened at the word charity. He didn't like it at all, and she watched him weigh the cost of that rumor, spreading against the cost of the money and land, grudgingly, on the money. He offered her 1 year's funding and told her flatly that it was more than she deserved. 7 years. He came back with 3, sharper this time. She said nothing at all and let the silence do the rest of the negotiating. It worked. He raised the number to 5, visibly hating that he was now haggling with an 8-year-old over the terms of her own survival. She didn't blink, and she didn't repeat herself either. She simply waited, the patient way she'd once waited out a difficult client across a very different kind of table in a life that no longer belonged to her, and let him talk himself the rest of the way there on his own. He tapped one finger against the desk twice while he decided. A small habit she filed away without meaning to. It was the only tell he had. Everything else about him stayed perfectly composed. 7, he said at last, flatly. The way a man approves an expense report, not the way a man funds his own child's survival. She pushed once more while the door was still open. May I take a few maids and knights with me? He waved a hand, already finished with her, already looking back down at the papers waiting on his desk, and told her she could take whoever was foolish enough to volunteer. He didn't care who, so long as it cost the house nothing further, and she was gone from the capital within 2 weeks. She took the word before he could think better of it and take it back. He said one more thing before she left, and it wasn't a threat, which was somehow worse. As far as he was concerned, he told her, she was no longer his daughter. Once she walked out of this house, she was never to walk back into it. Charlotte bowed the way the old Charlotte would have, silent, correct, no argument offered, and walked out of the office with a 2-week deadline, a 7-year budget, and permission to bring whoever wanted to come with her. Alone in the corridor, she allowed herself exactly 1 breath. Then she started making a list, what the money would buy, who might actually volunteer to follow a disgraced 8-year-old into a wasteland, and what she'd need to build there before anyone found a reason to take even this away from her. Somewhere in the last 2 days, without noticing the exact moment it happened, she had stopped waiting for someone to fix this for her. By the 4th morning after her father's office, Charlotte had every commoner maid in the house standing in her sitting room, and she didn't waste breath working up to the question. You've all heard I'm leaving this house in 2 weeks, she said. I want to know if anyone here is foolish enough to come with me. If you are, step forward now. Nobody moved. A dozen maids stared at the floorboards like the floorboards had personally wronged them. Charlotte had expected exactly this, and had already decided what she'd do with the silence. Turn around, write off the household staff entirely, and hire strangers once she reached the frontier. She was 1 breath from doing it when a maid near the back broke rank. Mia stepped forward, fists already clenched at her chest, a habit that looked considerably older than she was. I was only ever hired to clean up after your temper, my lady. If you leave, there's no post left for me here. I have nowhere else to go. Please, take me with you. Remy came next, a half step behind and considerably steadier. The church orphanage would take me back, Remy said, but I'd work a full day there and still go to bed hungry, same as always. If I can eat where you're going, I'll follow you there instead. 2. Out of a room of a dozen. Charlotte had walked in expecting 0, and for the length of one breath, she let herself feel exactly how much of a difference that was before her face went back to business. Charlotte studied them both a moment before she answered. This has to be your own choice. Nobody's forcing either of you onto a wagon. Say yes now, and there's no changing your mind once we're past the gate. But say no just as easily, and nothing happens to you for it. Neither girl hesitated. Charlotte asked what they could actually do. Washing, sewing, horses, and got her answer fast. Mia could manage a team of horses and sew passably. Remy could wash and mend, but had never handled a horse in her life, and asked, in the same breath, whether a boy from her orphanage who'd apprenticed at a stable could come too. Charlotte agreed before the sentence was even finished. 2 wagons then, not 1, and someone to drive the second. The rest of the maids filed out fast, eyes down, relieved to have gone unnoticed. Charlotte let them go without comment. That night, she wrote both names into the household ledger herself, in the column marked staff instead of the column marked assigned, and revised her own count of the household from 2 servants doing her a favor to 2 people escaping something worse than whatever she was offering. It didn't change what she'd promised them. It changed slightly how she planned to keep the promise. 2 maids solved, 1 household still short a night. That same afternoon, Charlotte crossed the ducal training grounds for the first time in her life, and every blade on the yard stopped moving the moment she stepped onto it. She ordered only the commoner-born knights to step forward. A wage bought more loyalty than a title did in her experience, and loyalty was the only thing she actually needed. Nobody stepped forward. She'd expected that too, and had already turned to leave when a voice cut across the yard from the noble ranks instead. You only asked the commoners. A young knight fell into step beside her without waiting to be invited, close enough now that she could read the crest stitched into his practice colors. A noble's mark, not a commoner's. Might have had better luck with the rest of us. And you're volunteering, Charlotte said. Do I get a name with that, or just the opinion? Alfred. He extended a hand like the introduction itself were an afterthought. And yeah, volunteering. Why? He shrugged. Easy. Like the question bored him. Nothing better to do around here. It was a thin excuse, and they both knew it. Charlotte decided she didn't need the real reason yet, only whether he'd hold to whatever this was. 3 years minimum, she said. We leave in 2 weeks, and you bring your own supplies. Enough to spare, not just enough to survive. He agreed on the spot, without asking what he'd be paid or where they were actually going. When she added, almost as an afterthought, that she was leaving with next to nothing of her own, his easy expression flickered. Just once, just long enough for her to notice he hadn't expected that part. Behind him, one of the older knights muttered something disbelieving that she didn't quite catch and didn't need to. She didn't know yet if Alfred was bored, curious, or covering for something else entirely, and his face gave her nothing further to work with. She took him anyway. A whim was still a body, and a body was one more person standing between her and an empty frontier. His reasons could wait until she had the luxury of caring about anything that wasn't logistics. Her old tutor arrived unannounced a few mornings later, catching Charlotte mid-breakfast. Remy burst in to announce the visit so fast she nearly upended the tea cart doing it, and Charlotte, midway through a plate she'd been in no hurry to finish, told her to calm down and set a proper tray instead. The tutor was startled to find the household's most feared occupant answering the summons herself, without a maid sent ahead to screen the visit first. I wasn't informed you were leaving until this week, she said, once Charlotte had waved her into a chair. Forgive coming like this. I had to see for myself. Charlotte had her own questions first. She asked about the territory waiting for her, the old Benberg lands, and got back exactly the answer she didn't want. Poor soil, brutal winters, and so few knights posted there in recent years that monsters wandered it more or less unchallenged. She filed that under things to plan around, rather than things to panic over, and made a mental note to bring food enough for more than just herself. Then she noticed the obvious thing she should have noticed sooner. A tutor hired to teach a duke's daughter had no daughter left to teach once that daughter left the house. What happens to your position once I'm gone? Charlotte asked. Her answer came a beat too smooth, the kind of smooth that meant it had been rehearsed already. She didn't have anything lined up yet, the tutor said, but she'd manage. Charlotte understood the rest without being told. The household needed someone to blame for years of a spoiled child's temper, and the tutor closest to that child was the easiest, safest target once the child herself was out of reach. I was rude to you, Charlotte said, for longer than I can excuse. I'm sorry for it. The tutor went quiet a moment too long, visibly caught off guard by an apology this particular student had never once offered in 7 years. "You've changed," she said finally. "I only wish I'd seen it sooner, for both our sakes." An apology alone wouldn't cover the debt, as far as Charlotte was concerned. She went to her room, chose a handful of her most valuable jewels, and wrote out a full accounting of each one on ducal stationery before pressing both letter and jewels into the tutor's hands. The tutor refused twice, insisting it was far more than any severance owed her. Charlotte insisted back until refusing cost more effort than accepting did, and the tutor finally took both with shaking hands, saying nothing further about it. It was a small debt, one nobody else in the house would have bothered to notice existed. Charlotte left the reception room satisfied that this one, at least, was settled. Departure morning arrived exactly 2 weeks after the office, the way she'd made sure it would. Her father's mark long faded from her cheek by now. Charlotte spent the last of the dawn doing the parts of leaving nobody else could do for her, sewing a handful of her most valuable jewels into the lining of a stocking, in case a strongbox ever went missing on a bad road, and meeting the household steward one final time to confirm everything on her list had actually been done. It had. 7 years of budget, converted down into gold, silver, and copper coin, and locked into a strongbox small enough to ride in the carriage with her. 2 covered wagons loaded with seed potatoes, wool, cloth, and lumber, enough to start building something out of nothing, plus tools, medicine, and a full set of medical books, since there would be no physician waiting for her once she crossed out of the capital. The steward received her final check without a flicker of expression and told her once that it was done. She still had no idea, after 7 years under this roof, whether the man liked her even slightly. She decided it no longer mattered. She ate more than she needed to at breakfast, on the theory that it might be a while before a meal came this easy again, then spent the rest of the morning packing her own room down to the furniture, every last piece of it crated and labeled, in case there was ever a future where she came back for it. Nobody stopped her. Nobody asked why she bothered. Nobody from the family came down to see her off. She hadn't expected them to, and the empty doorway didn't cost her anything she noticed losing. Alfred was already mounted and waiting by the time she reached the courtyard. "There you are," he said, not bothering to hide his grin. "Was starting to think you'd locked yourself in for good. Some of us pack." Mia stood by the first wagon, checking the harness on the horses herself, rather than trusting the stable hands to have done it right. Remy and the stable boy she'd vouched for were loading the second wagon with the food stores, stacking sacks of grain against crates that rattled with jarred preserves. 4 ducal guards sat mounted in escort positions around the carriage itself, where the strongbox, the potions, and the rest of the supply list were already stowed away. Charlotte climbed into the carriage without a backward look at the house. It pulled through the gate a few minutes later with her small, hand-picked household strung out around it, and nobody in the capital came out to watch it go. By the 3rd morning on the road, the procession reached a town large enough to have an inn worth stopping at. A relief, after 2 nights of caring considerably less about scenery than about not sleeping in a wagon. Alfred rode up alongside the carriage window with news she hadn't been expecting. "Happy birthday, miss," he said. "You're 8 today. We'll swing by the church before noon." She'd genuinely forgotten. The old Charlotte had once demanded parties planned months in advance, whole wings of the house redecorated for a single afternoon of attention. This year, she hadn't remembered the date existed until a knight mentioned it in passing on a dirt road. She decided that trade was, on balance, a fair one. Alfred watched her reaction a moment. "You've been different since we left the capital. Not a complaint, just noticing." Behind him, one of the escort knights pressed close enough to be overheard, still running an argument he'd apparently kept up since they'd left the gate. Keith, she'd learned his name over the last 2 days, mostly from how often he said it about himself, was trying, again, to talk Alfred into turning the party back around once she was safely delivered to the frontier. Charlotte let herself enjoy, privately, the idea of Keith's face if Alfred ever actually chose to stay instead. He was already turning his horse before she could ask him anything further. "Today might change things for you, miss," he said. "Let's keep moving." He rode off ahead of the carriage without waiting to see if she'd finished with him, leaving her to guess whether that last line had been about the birthday or about something else he wasn't in a hurry to explain. Keith fell in after him, still arguing, still unanswered. Charlotte watched them go and found she couldn't tell, 3 days into knowing him, whether Alfred had actually chosen her or whether she was simply the most convenient reason he'd found yet to leave everything else behind. Either way, the wagons kept moving north. She had a household now, small and strange, and entirely her own. and a knight riding just ahead of her whose reasons hadn't been handed over yet. Charlotte remembered turning 8 the first time only in secondhand pieces. A gown laid out the night before. Careful excitement she hadn't earned but had apparently inherited anyway. That girl had never once doubted her attribute would be fire, the same as her father, the same as every eldest Fitzgerald going back 4 generations. Charlotte doubted it plenty. She had spent the whole ride to the chapel running the numbers on what she actually wanted out of this ceremony, and fire wasn't high on the list. A working furnace might be, if it came with a proper dial instead of whatever open flame arrangement this world called cooking. The chapel didn't know or care about any of that. A line of priests met the carriage in the yard and bowed low enough that she briefly worried about their spines, then ushered her inside with the kind of ceremony usually reserved for someone whose father hadn't just exiled her to a frontier ruin. Word apparently traveled slower than shame did. Nobody here had gotten the memo yet that she was supposed to be an embarrassment. The main sanctuary held the real spectacle first. 4 statues, twice her own height, each caught mid-gesture, flame rising from an open palm, a wave frozen at its peak, a robe bent sideways by wind that wasn't actually blowing, stones splitting to lift a shard of mountain off the floor. A junior priest recited a short blessing in front of each one while Charlotte waited, more bored than reverent, wanting to get to the part that actually mattered. Alfred walked her as far as the inner doors, and then simply stopped, without being told to. "I'll be right out here. That's either a comfort or a threat. I can't decide which." "Take it as both," he said. Efficient use of one sentence. He said it with the same flat calm he used for everything, and for once, she almost wanted him to come in with her instead of waiting outside like the rest of her escort. The priest at the inner doors cleared his throat, polite but immovable, and Charlotte understood that whatever came next, she was doing it alone. A pair of junior priests and one of the escort knights stood along the wall as customary witnesses, the way they would for any noble child's right. 4 statues stood in the center of the room, waist high, back to back, one for each god this world had bothered to name: fire, water, wind, earth. The priest explained the rite in the voice of a man who had said the same words more times than he could count. She was to approach whichever statue her instinct pulled her toward and touch its foot. Something would happen after that. A skill sometimes. A blessing if she was lucky. Nothing. Almost never. Charlotte went to the fire statue first, since that was what her whole family assumed about her, and pressed her palm flat against its stone foot. Nothing happened. Not a spark, not a flicker of warmth, not so much as an itch in her hand. The priest made a small, careful sound, the professional cough of a man choosing his next sentence with unusual care. "It isn't always the attribute one expects, my lady. Perhaps clear your mind and try again." She cleared her mind. She tried the water statue next, standing there long enough to feel foolish about it, and got exactly as much from it as she'd gotten from fire. Wind gave her nothing either, though she stood in front of it a full minute out of stubbornness. By the time she reached the last statue, earth, she'd stopped expecting a result and started simply going through the motions, because stopping halfway would have meant admitting something out loud that she wasn't ready to say yet. Earth gave her nothing too. 4 statues, 4 cold stone feet, 4 times, absolutely nothing. The priest's careful expression had slipped somewhere around statue number 3, and by 4, he wasn't bothering to hide it anymore. He checked something in a ledger, then checked it again, the way people double-check bad news, hoping it changes on the second read. "Is there a problem?" Charlotte asked. "No, my lady. Simply thorough." She didn't believe him, and by the look on his face, he didn't fully believe himself either. Whatever came next, she understood it was going to be worse than 4 silent statues. The mist came up around her ankles before she noticed it had started. By the time it reached her shoulders, Charlotte understood she wasn't looking at the ceremony room anymore. Someone stood in front of her instead. Barely a someone, more shape than face, wrapped in the same pale haze as the air around them both. "You're a god," not really a question. "Are you the one who sent me here?" No. The shape flinched, like the question had physically landed on her. "I'm this world's goddess. That's all I am. Whoever brought you here, it wasn't me." "Then what can you actually give me? Magic? Skills? Anything?" "That depends on what you're granted," the goddess said. "Which is, technically, what's happening right now." "Then hurry up and grant it well." That answer solved nothing, and it made her angrier than a real answer would have. She had spent the whole carriage ride rehearsing exactly what she'd ask for the moment a god finally stood in front of her, and she used all of it now, fast and specific. Running water on demand, real heat that didn't come from an open flame, a house with the kind of conveniences her old world had stopped noticing it even had. machines that cleaned on their own, air that stayed cool in summer and warm in winter without anyone shoveling coal, a box that lifted a person between floors instead of stairs. A basic, decent, cultured life, Charlotte said. Where I'm from, that's practically the law. The goddess made a small, strangled sound that might have been agreement. I could. There might be a way to arrange something like, she trailed off, and the mist held there, undecided. While behind Charlotte, the priest waited with the patience of a man who had done this 1,000 times and expected the 1,001st to go exactly the same way. It didn't. The mist stayed pale and thin far longer than it should have, and when the priest finally checked the ledger in his hands, his face did something careful and professional that Charlotte had already learned not to trust. The reading is complete, my lady. There was no version of the next sentence that came out soft, so he didn't try to make it one. You have been assessed as no attribute. Somewhere behind her, one of the watching knights shifted his weight, and a junior priest's quill scratched to a stop mid-note. Small sounds, barely audible, and each one confirmed that everyone else in the room had heard it too. Nobody in the room moved. Charlotte had braced herself for fire on the ride over, and for nothing at all somewhere around the second silent statue, and she still hadn't braced for this. An answer that didn't seem to exist as an option anywhere she'd expected one. No attribute. Not water, not wind, not earth, not fire. Nothing at all, according to every god this world had bothered to name. The mist flickered before it could fully clear, and the goddess's shape came back into it, more agitated than before. Wait, that's not… There might still be… A pause, worse than the first. Construction. Charlotte's hands reached toward the shape, like she could pull an answer out of the fog by force. What does that mean? The goddess's mist flickered, uncertain. I'm not entirely… Summon, maybe? I don't… The rite has concluded. The priest's voice came down flat and final, aimed less at Charlotte than at the mist itself. He stepped forward, and the pale light thinned to nothing between one blink and the next, taking the goddess's unfinished sentence with it. For about 3 seconds, Charlotte considered handling this with dignity. Then she didn't. She rounded on the priest and informed him, in considerable and specific detail, that interrupting a goddess mid-sentence was the single worst piece of ceremonial timing in recorded history, and that whatever she had just been branded as was entirely his fault for cutting the conversation off at exactly the wrong moment. The priest backed toward the door, apologizing to a furious 8-year-old in the same formal phrasing he probably used on visiting dukes. He was still backing up when Alfred let himself in. "Everything all right in here?" he asked, which was either the bravest or the stupidest thing anyone had said to her all morning. No. The word came out loud enough to make one of the chamber's candles gutter. "Do I look all right?" He looked her over, flushed, furious, her ceremonial hair coming loose at one temple, considered the question honestly, and wisely chose not to answer it. Instead, he crossed the room, picked her up under one arm like a sack of good flour instead of a duke's daughter, and carried her out past the priest, who looked so relieved to see her go that he nearly bowed to Alfred on the way past. "Put me down," came Charlotte's voice, muffled, from somewhere around his hip. "In a minute," he said. "Let's find you somewhere with fewer statues first." Later, once her temper had cooled enough to think in full sentences again, she caught herself doing the math a different way. If she'd somehow gotten fire after all, this exact morning could have ended with the chapel on fire, and half the priesthood explaining themselves to the Duke. No attribute, at least, hadn't hurt anyone. It had just made her furious, quietly, in a stone room, where nobody but a nervous goddess would ever know how close it had come to being worse. By the time Charlotte had changed back into traveling clothes and climbed into the carriage, she'd had almost an hour to notice something worse than the humiliation itself. She still couldn't feel anything. No warmth sitting under her skin, no pull toward any direction, nothing that felt like magic waiting to be used. Whatever no attribute actually meant, her own body seemed to agree with the verdict completely. Once you're granted an attribute, you're supposed to feel it, Alfred said. Over the lunch, someone had set up trailside. A pull, usually. Some people get it stronger than others. And if you don't feel anything at all, then you probably got a subtle one. Happens more than people admit to. He shrugged it off easily, like it wasn't the exact question she'd been too afraid to ask him directly. Wanted fire, did you? Most of your family does. Charlotte let him think that. It was easier than the alternative, and she still didn't have a better explanation to offer than the true one. That a priest had looked her dead in the eye and told her she had nothing at all, and a goddess had said 2 words that meant nothing to anyone yet. including, apparently, the goddess herself. Something like that. She ate her stew instead of finishing the sentence. It was better than anything she'd eaten since waking up in this body. Thick, dark, closer to a proper meal than she'd expected out of a folding table set up on the side of a dirt road. Alfred watched her eat it without asking anything else, which she was grateful for and slightly suspicious of in equal measure. He hadn't pushed once since the chapel doors closed behind them. She still couldn't tell whether that was tact or simply him not caring enough to bother. At one point, he studied her a beat too long over his own bowl, like he was recalculating something, then apparently decided against saying whatever it was. That was new. 3 days ago, he wouldn't have looked twice. Either way, the carriage rolled on once lunch was cleared, and neither of them brought up the ceremony again for the rest of the afternoon. They traveled until sunset without stopping again, and the town they finally reached was small enough that Charlotte doubted it had a name worth remembering. The inn was shabby in the specific way that told her she had crossed some invisible line between the Duke's territory and everywhere else. Thin walls, a single lamp, an innkeeper who had no idea a duke's daughter had just walked in and wouldn't have cared if he had. She didn't mind it as much as she probably should have. Alfred noticed the state of the room before she did. "I can ask if there's somewhere better." "No, it's fine. I've slept in worse this month alone." That got the first real laugh out of him she'd heard since the chapel. Short, surprised, gone almost as soon as it started. Alfred arranged rooms for the night, while Keith saw to the horses outside, and Charlotte fell asleep faster than she expected to. For someone who had spent the day being told twice that she was worth nothing in the one way this world knew how to measure it. In the morning, Alfred and Keith went to collect the order Charlotte had sent ahead weeks earlier, and came back with considerably more animals than either of them had apparently expected to be hauling through a border town. "My lady," Alfred surveyed the 2 carts now parked behind him, one packed with crated chickens and pigs, the other carrying 3 cows Keith was leading on ropes, like he wasn't entirely convinced they wouldn't bolt. "You ordered a small farm." "I ordered the beginning of a large one," Charlotte said. "There's a difference." Keith, still holding the cow ropes, didn't look convinced that a wasteland exile had any business planning that far ahead. He had learned, 3 days into this trip, not to say so out loud. "They're good stock," he offered instead, which was as close as he'd come yet to speaking to her directly instead of around her. "Good. I intend to use every one of them." Charlotte glanced over the crates one more time, chickens shifting and clucking inside, and felt something steadier than she had all morning. Livestock, at least, didn't care what a priest's ledger said about her. Mia and Remy came out from the second wagon to help walk the crates onto the cart, familiar enough with animals now that neither of them flinched at the noise. 3 days on the road had already taught this household more about livestock than either maid had learned in a lifetime of city service. They asked after the road once the animals were loaded, and the answer was better than she expected. The former Benberg territory, the wasteland with her name now attached to it, was less than half a day's ride away. Nobody suggested resting first. Charlotte had no interest in spending one more night than necessary in a town full of strangers who didn't know yet what she had been branded, and the animals wouldn't improve with more time on the road. They pressed on before noon, 2 new carts falling in behind the ones that had carried her this far, heading for whatever was actually waiting for her at the end of it. There was no gate, no wall, no fence, not even a rotted post to mark where the road stopped being road and started being her territory, just dead grass, and past it, a 2-story mansion with paint peeling off in long gray strips. Charlotte climbed down, took one look at it, and made a decision before anyone could argue her out of it. Nothing came off the carts until someone had scrubbed the place first. "If a single trunk gets set down in that dust," she told the porters, "I am billing it to whoever set it down." Alfred offered her a hand for the last high step. She swatted it away and warned him that if he so much as smiled about it, she would kick him in the face on the way down. He kept a straight face, barely. Behind them, the 4 knights who had escorted her the whole way here were eyeing the missing wall like it personally offended them. A territory was supposed to have a boundary. This one apparently didn't, which meant, as far as they were concerned, anyone could walk in whenever they liked. She called Mia and Remy over and gave the order in 3 parts: her room first, the reception room second, the kitchen third. Then told the porters to wait until word came back that it was safe to bring the trunks inside. Mia bobbed a nervous half-bow and hurried off before the sentence had even finished. Remy followed at a steadier pace. "We should inspect the place properly before you settle on a room," Alfred said, already heading for the door. "Some of what's inside might change your mind." She followed him in, past Mia flinging open a shutter that shed a soft gray rain of dust onto the floor below. The kitchen had shelving enough for a real pantry, at least, though everything sitting on it was was decades past being useful for anything. The reception room was worse. The wallpaper had gone soft and brown at the seams, curling away from the wall in long sheets. "Cleaning won't save that," Alfred said, running a thumb along one seam and watching it flake off in his hand. "That wallpaper's coming down, whether we like it or not. New paper, probably new plaster underneath." Upstairs, there were two real choices: the master's room, bigger and darker, facing away from the morning sun, or the smaller room on the east side that had belonged to the Lord's wife. Alfred guessed she would want the east one, since she was always awake before anyone else in the household anyway. She looked at the warped shelving and the single surviving chair with its stuffing showing through a split seam, and picked the east room anyway. This one. She stepped past him into the doorway like the decision was already final. Clean it first. Everything else can wait its turn. It was not really about the light, or the furniture, or which room had belonged to which dead noblewoman. It was the one decision in this entire miserable day that was actually hers to make, and she intended to make it before anyone else made it for her. She told the driver she would wait right where she was, and climbed back into the carriage before Alfred could suggest anything else. 4 days of road, a chapel ceremony that had gone about as badly as a ceremony could go, and now a mansion held together mostly by habit. She had earned 10 minutes of sitting down and not deciding anything. Through the window, she could see the knights still standing around the gap where a gate should have been, looking like men guarding a door that was not there. Someone laughed at something Keith said. Someone else told him to quit talking and help with the crates. 10 minutes turned into longer. The carriage was warm and still and smelled of dust and horse, and she was asleep before she had finished deciding whether to let herself be. She woke to someone shaking her shoulder and the carriage door already standing open. The mansion in front of her was not the mansion she had fallen asleep looking at. The peeling paint was gone, not patched, not painted over, gone, replaced with clean pale wood that caught the late sun like it had never known a season of weather. The windows that had been fogged gray with grime an hour ago were throwing back a clear reflection of the sky. The roof tiles sat flush and even, not one crooked or missing anywhere along the whole line of the roof. Even the dead grass at her feet looked greener, as if something had passed through it on the way to the house and set it right without slowing down. She climbed out and walked the length of the front wall with one hand trailing along it, half expecting the wood to come away chalky the way old paint always did. It did not. It was solid and cool and real, and it had not been any of those things 4 hours ago. "Young lady," Alfred's voice, when he finally found one. "Were you sleeping through all of this?" "Through what exactly?" He did not answer that. He just looked at the house, then at her, then back at the house, the way a person recounts the same impossible number twice, hoping the second count comes out smaller. Neither of them had an explanation, and for a long moment, neither tried to force one. They stood there together, looking at a mansion that had gone from ruin to finished home in the time it took one exhausted girl to fall asleep 20 feet away. Inside was the same story. The dust was gone. The wallpaper Alfred had called unsalvageable an hour earlier was simply gone too, replaced with plain, clean walls. No sofa, no side table, nothing decorative, just finished, empty rooms. Like a house built in a great hurry by someone who cared only about function. Mia and Remy stood frozen just inside the doorway, buckets still in hand, staring at a kitchen they had not gotten further than dusting. "Is your attribute wind, by any chance?" Alfred asked, turning slowly on the spot to take in all of it at once. Blew every scrap of dust out in one pass. He stopped turning and frowned harder. Except wind would not leave it looking like this. This is too clean, too finished for wind. She opened her mouth to answer that honestly, for once, because she genuinely had no better guess than he did. "Lord Alfred," Keith jogged up before she got the chance, jerking a thumb back toward the carts. "Can we start unloading now, or are we still waiting on her?" Alfred glanced at the sky, did some private math about daylight and livestock and unpacked crates, and made his choice without asking her opinion on it. "We will talk later," he told her, already turning to go. "Have Mia bring you some tea. She went for water a while ago." He was gone before she could point out that was not actually an answer to anything she had asked. Her room upstairs had been scrubbed down to bare wood and one surviving chair, exactly as promised, and not one thing more. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed a hand into the mattress. Thin, but not rotten. It would do well enough with her own bedding laid over it, and she was glad, right then, that she had insisted on bringing both duvets from the capital. The thin one for warm nights, the thick one for cold ones. Both real feather, both worth more than every stick of furniture left in this house combined. Mia and Remy still had not come up to check on her. She considered going down to find them and rejected the idea immediately. She was not about to go looking for her own maids like she needed the company. If Alfred wanted to know how she was settling in, he could climb the stairs himself and ask. He did not. She lay back, tired enough that sleep should have taken her the moment her head hit the pillow, and instead found herself wide awake, staring at a ceiling that no longer had a single water stain on it. That was when she felt it. Not a sound exactly, not quite a movement, just the sense that the room had stopped being empty. She turned her head toward the corner near the wardrobe and caught something small, shifting at the very edge of the lamplight, gone again before her eyes could settle on it. She was too tired to be properly afraid of it. If anything, she was mildly curious. Then her eyelids closed on their own, and she stopped fighting it. She surfaced once, briefly, into a room that was not quite the same room she had fallen asleep in. There was a sofa against the far wall now, low-backed, plain, the exact shape she had been picturing without quite meaning to as she drifted off. A low table sat in front of it, already in the precise spot she would have chosen herself, and moving busily around both of them, small and quick and wearing little pointed hats, were shapes she could not get a clear look at, no matter how hard she tried to focus on any single one. She tried to say something, a question, a warning, anything. Her mouth would not cooperate. She tried to sit up instead. Her body would not cooperate either. Her arms too heavy to lift off the mattress, her eyelids already dragging themselves shut again, no matter how hard she fought to keep them open. The last thing she registered before the dark folded back over her was that the shapes had gone still, as if they had noticed her noticing them, and were simply waiting for her to lose the fight. The next time she opened her eyes, Alfred was crouched by the bed. "Stay lying down," he said, a hand firm on her shoulder before she could sit up. "You are not hurt. You just used a great deal of magic in one go, and your body is making you pay the difference now." "I did not use any magic." She pushed his hand off anyway and sat up regardless. "And you would know that if you had actually listened to me earlier instead of running off to count chickens. You never said it plainly." "I am saying it plainly now." She fixed him with a look. "Since when do you think I have wind magic? Did you see me cast anything? Did anyone see anything at all? Or did you just decide it had to be me because you could not think of another explanation? Because nobody else in this house can use magic, and the entire mansion rebuilt itself in one afternoon." He counted the logic off on his fingers like it was obvious. "That leaves you. It has to be you." "It does not, actually." She held his eyes. "I am no attribute. Assessed on the record, in front of witnesses, at the chapel. Nothing. Not fire, not wind, not one single spark of anything." Alfred went completely still. He did not say anything for long enough that she nearly repeated herself just to fill the silence. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost every bit of its earlier certainty. "Then who," he said slowly, "fixed the house?" "I do not know." She almost told him about the little shapes then, and asked instead, flat, "Did you see anyone else in this room tonight? Small, wearing hats, moving the furniture around while I was out." He looked at her the way people look at someone they have decided is exhausted rather than lying, and told her, gently, that she should get some rest. He lingered a moment at the door afterward, like there was something else he meant to say, and then did not say it. That was somehow worse than if he had just called her a liar outright. "Get out," she said, and he went, closing the door softly behind him. She lay back against the pillow and looked at the sofa that had not existed 6 hours ago, sitting exactly where she would have put it herself if anyone had asked. Whatever had built it was not going to explain itself tonight. She was going to have to find that out on her own. Charlotte opened her eyes and lifted one hand off the blanket just to check. It rose, slowly, and it shook a little at the top, but it rose. That was new. Yesterday, it hadn't. She lay there a moment longer, taking stock of herself the way she'd take stock of a damaged shipment. Legs, heavy but working. Head, thick but clearing. That strange hollowed out feeling behind her ribs, fainter than it had been. Whatever building this mansion out of nothing had cost her, it was finally letting go. Mia knocked once and came in with a water pitcher before Charlotte could answer, saw her sitting up, and nearly dropped the tray. "You're awake," Mia caught herself. Good morning, Charlotte-sama. Lady Charlotte, I'm sorry. I don't know which one you've decided on yet." "Whichever gets me dressed faster," Charlotte said. "Are the knights still here?" "Just arrived with the last of the trunks, my lady." Charlotte was already swinging her legs out of bed. Whatever this morning cost her later, it wasn't going to cost her the next hour. 2 knights carried a trunk through the front doors and set it down hard enough to rattle the window glass. Alfred trailed in behind them, arms crossed, watching Charlotte come down the stairs like he already knew what she was going to say. "Don't!" She held up a hand before he could open his mouth. "This is my house. You don't get to lounge in my front hall like you own it." "I did help pick it," Alfred said mildly. "You helped me survive it. That's different." She waved toward the door. "Out, both of you. I have a village to address within the hour, and none of you have told me one useful thing about it yet." Alfred didn't move right away, which was its own kind of answer. He never did anything on command, only ever after deciding it suited him. "As you like, my lord." He went anyway, which was the closest thing to obedience she was going to get out of him today. Mia and Remy were still arguing over which crate held the good pot when Charlotte walked in. Remy spoke first. "I was sorting the luggage," she said quickly, before anyone had asked. "I was going to start on breakfast," Mia added, just as fast, which meant neither of them had actually finished either. Charlotte pinched the bridge of her nose. "I don't care whose excuse is better. I care that in less than an hour, I'm standing in front of every person who lives on this land, and so far, this household's only accomplishment is tea that tastes like boiled dirt." She'd tried a cup earlier, out of desperation, and regretted it instantly. Keith chose that moment to lean through the doorway. "Alfred," he said, "the villagers are all ready. You report to me." Charlotte didn't turn around. Not to him. "Try again." A muscle worked in Keith's jaw. "Charlotte-sama, the villagers are gathering." Better. She untied the apron she hadn't meant to put on. Somewhere in the last 5 minutes she apparently had, and headed for the door. "Let's go meet my new subjects." She had expected a crowd. What she got was maybe 30 old men standing in loose rows, hands folded. Not one of them under 60 by the look of him. No children anywhere. No one who could have carried her luggage in from the road without stopping twice to catch his breath. "Is this everyone?" she asked. "Everyone." Alfred had gone door to door himself, he told her. "Then where is everyone else?" "There isn't an else, my lord." He nodded at the rows of bowed, silvered heads. "The crown's been paying just enough to keep this lot fed and nothing more, for years. Nobody young stays somewhere with no future in it. The ones who could leave, left. The ones who couldn't stayed and got old waiting." That at least explained the silence. These weren't people refusing to be impressed. They'd simply stopped expecting anything from a lord long before she arrived. Knowing why didn't make the silence any easier to stand in. "I am Charlotte Fitzgerald," she said, pitching her voice to Carrie. "Your new lord, as of today. You may call me Lady Charlotte, a beat, or my lord, if the men among you can stomach it. I've decided I don't much care which." Not a murmur, not a shifted foot. "I intend to rule this territory as an absolute authority," she went on, "but not a tyrant. There's a difference, and I expect you to notice it eventually, even if none of you can quite manage to look impressed today." Still nothing. Tired faces, waiting for a disappointment they'd clearly already decided was coming. Something behind her ribs pulled tighter with every second that passed, the way a rope pulls tighter right before it decides whether to hold. "You will answer to me from now on." The words scraped out of her louder and sharper than she'd meant them, before she'd fully decided to raise her voice at all. "Do you understand? To me." The air changed before anyone moved. It came on like a held breath finally breaking, a pressure rolling outward from somewhere behind her ribs, low and heavy, pressing in every direction at once. Charlotte felt it leave her before she understood what it was, something she'd been holding without knowing she held it, all at once no longer held. The villager at the front went down first, knees folding as if a hand had pressed flat on his shoulders, then the next, then a dozen more in a ragged wave rolling outward from where she stood, old men sinking into the dirt one after another, gasping, hands braced against the ground like men caught in a wind none of them could see. Alfred staggered half a step, one hand slamming against the gatepost to hold himself up. Behind her, Keith dropped to one knee, swearing under his breath. Nobody's eyes had glazed over. Nobody was kneeling because she'd told them to. They were kneeling because the air itself had turned into something solid enough to lean on, and it was leaning on all of them at once, and not one of them could stay upright under the weight of it. Charlotte understood distantly that she was doing this. That thought arrived a full second before the backlash did. It hit her like something being drained out through her own skin, a swaying, sick, rushing sensation. The ground tilting under her feet, though she hadn't moved an inch. Her vision blurred at the edges, going gray and soft, the square narrowing down to a tunnel with gasping men at the bottom of it. She recognized the feeling. That was the worst part. It was the same hollowed out, draining pull she'd woken from 2 mornings before, except this time she was standing up in front of witnesses, and it was getting worse instead of fading. "Everyone, just listen to me," she got out, not because it would help, but because talking was the only thing keeping her upright. One word laid down after another, like stepping stones over water she was about to fall into. Her knees buckled on the last word. Alfred's arm caught her before she went all the way down. "That's enough." His grip tightened around her, his voice dropping low against her ear. "Charlotte, stop pushing it. Just stop." She wanted to answer him. She was fairly sure she managed something, though she never remembered afterward what it was. The gray at the edges of her vision closed in from both sides at once, and the square, the kneeling villagers, Alfred's hand on her arm, all of it went out like a snuffed candle. Charlotte woke up in her own bed for the second time in 3 days, staring at the same ceiling, with the same hollow ache behind her ribs. She remembered the square. She remembered the old men dropping like puppets with their strings cut, and Alfred's arm catching her before the world went dark. She remembered, distinctly, deciding to keep talking so she wouldn't fall down, and then falling down anyway. She lay there a moment, waiting to feel more embarrassed about that than she actually did. Mostly what she felt was hungry. She followed the smell of food and the sound of voices, and stopped in the doorway long enough to confirm what she was hearing. Alfred, Mia, and Remy, already halfway through a meal without her. "You started without me." 3 heads turned at once. Mia nearly choked on a mouthful of bread. Remy set her spoon down very carefully, the way people set things down when they're trying not to be noticed doing it. Alfred was already rising to fix her a plate, unbothered. "You collapsed for 6 hours, my lord. We assumed you'd sleep through supper entirely. That was a guess, not a fact. Next time, guess in my favor." She sat and let him put food in front of her before she said anything else, because arguing on an empty stomach had never once gone well for her. The bread was plain, and the soup was thin, and she ate all of it anyway, faster than was strictly dignified. By the time she'd finished, she had a short list of questions lined up in her head, and only one of them mattered enough yet to ask out loud. "Alfred," she pushed her empty bowl aside. "Sit down. We need to talk about what happened in that square." "I need you to tell me the truth," Charlotte said, once the door was shut. "Not the fire story, the real one." Alfred didn't ask what she meant. He'd been waiting for this since the night she'd let it slip. "You told me you were graded no attribute. Not disappointing, not a demotion, nothing at all." "Nothing at all," she agreed. She turned her teacup once on the table, not drinking from it. "So explain to me how a girl with nothing at all just knocked a square full of grown men off their feet without laying a hand on one of them." "That," Alfred said, "is the question I've been avoiding since the mansion rebuilt itself in a single afternoon." It was the first time either of them had said it plainly. Something in Charlotte's chest loosened slightly, just from not having to carry the question alone anymore. "The goddess used 2 words on me at the ceremony." Charlotte turned the memory over slowly, like handling something breakable. "Construction, and something like directing what she'd made. Summoning it, maybe. I didn't understand either one at the time. I thought she was just embarrassed and grasping for an excuse." Alfred sat forward, elbows on his knees, the teasing gone out of his voice entirely. "Construction, and command over what you've constructed." He said it slowly, like he was fitting the edges of 2 broken pieces together. "Your little people in the dark. The mansion, rebuilt down to the last roof tile, in one night, while 2 maids who'd barely started cleaning stood there and watched it happen around them. And today, a whole crowd on its knees, and you never said a single word to compel one of them. Say it." Charlotte's fingers tightened around the cup. "Whatever you're about to call it, just say it. Manifest." Alfred let the word sit a moment before he went on. "That's what I'd call it, if I had to put a name to it. You don't build with your hands, and you don't order people to obey you. You picture something clearly enough, and something answers you and makes it real. I'd guess the little people aren't separate from you at all. They're the how. You're the why." It fit. It fit so precisely that Charlotte felt almost angry at how simple it was, now that someone had finally said it out loud. "Then what happened in the square wasn't me giving an order. No, that was just overflow. Too much of it, with nowhere to go, until it went somewhere anyway." Alfred's face had lost every trace of its usual dryness, which means you need to be careful. Whatever you ask your little people to build, keep it small for now. Small work, small cost. Push it the way you pushed it today, and next time, you might not wake up in 6 hours. You might not wake up at all. Charlotte didn't argue with that. She'd felt the pull firsthand. She wasn't in a hurry to argue with the thing that had put her flat on her back twice in 3 days. What she felt instead, underneath the relief of finally having a name for it, was a colder thought she kept to herself, that whatever she was carrying was bigger than one afternoon's overflow, and she had no idea yet how much bigger it was going to get. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she was also fairly certain the goddess owed her a considerably better house than this one, and had simply hoped she wouldn't notice the difference. Far from the mansion, in a place with no walls and no need of them, the goddess who had granted Charlotte her power was still shaking. She hadn't stopped since the girl's temper spiked that afternoon. She'd felt it from here, a distant ripple through the thin thread that still connected a god to a power she'd handed out and never fully understood. It had taken everything she had not to bolt the moment it hit her. She found the other four gathered at their usual round table, the light goddess among them for once, glowing with the particular satisfaction of someone who had just done something well. "It's been ages since I felt that," the light goddess was saying, to general approval. "A soul that resonates with mine, clear as a bell. Whoever that child grows into, she'll light up half the continent." The others murmured their agreement. The earth goddess said nothing. She slid into the empty seat at the far end of the table and let herself feel, for one small moment, something close to relief. Whatever she'd handed that furious red-haired girl, at least it wasn't fire. Fire would have ended somebody by now. She allowed herself a single private hope, that wherever this new, light-blessed child ended up, her path might someday cross Charlotte's and soften something in her that the earth goddess had clearly never learned how to reach. Alfred left not long after, under orders to say nothing to Mia or Remy about what they'd worked out. Not yet, not until she'd decided how much of it she wanted anyone else to know. Charlotte sat alone with the cooling tea, and the name she finally had for the thing living under her skin, Manifest. It didn't sound dangerous. It sounded almost tidy, almost manageable, the kind of word a person could write on a report and file away. She'd felt it firsthand twice now, and tidy was the last word she'd have chosen for it. Whatever this was, it had built her a mansion overnight and dropped 30 strangers to their knees without her laying a finger on any of them, and she still didn't know where the ceiling on it was. She only knew she hadn't found it yet. Learning where that ceiling was, she decided, was going to be her problem for a while. Charlotte's knuckles had gone bloodless around a fistful of Alfred's coat before the horse had taken 10 steps. She still didn't trust the thing not to decide, on its own, that today was the day it threw her into a ditch. "You could hold the reins," Alfred said. "That's generally how riding works. I'll hold on to you instead. You're less likely to bolt." He didn't argue that one. The territory itself was the real problem. Alfred put it at 5 times the size of the old Fitzgerald estate, and every acre of it looked like the last one. Flat, brown, empty. Old plow lines still cut through the dirt here and there. Ghosts of farms nobody had worked in years. There were no fences, no stakes, no markers of any kind to say where her land ended and someone else's began. "So the border is just wherever I say it is?" Charlotte asked. "More or less. Nobody's contested this dirt in a long time." That answer didn't sit right with her. A border that existed only because nobody had bothered to argue about it wasn't a border. It was an invitation for monsters wandering out of the tree line, for a neighbor deciding the empty half was up for grabs, for anyone at all who wanted to test how far hers really went. A wall would fix that, she thought, a tall one, titanium, if she still remembered anything useful from her old life. She didn't say it out loud. It didn't seem worth saying out loud. Alfred nudged the horse into a trot without warning, and Charlotte spent the next several minutes too busy holding on to think about walls at all. Keith found them 3 days later, sprinting up the mansion steps with the kind of urgency usually reserved for monster sightings. "Alfred, there's something coming up out of the ground on the south road," he caught himself. "Oh, Lady Charlotte." She was already moving before he finished the sentence. The something turned out to be a line of pale silver barriers, low, maybe 10 centimeters high, running the length of the road in a seam as straight as a drawn line. No construction crew, no noise. Just there, overnight, as if the ground had grown a spine. Charlotte crouched and rapped a knuckle against it, solid, cold. She kicked it, harder than she needed to, and felt exactly the resistance she expected. "Titanium," she said. Alfred crouched beside her, running 2 fingers along the seam. "You're certain?" "I spent a previous life around this metal. I'm certain." Nobody in this world had the tools to forge titanium into anything, let alone a barrier running for 100 yards without a single rivet, which left one explanation, and she didn't love it. Sometime in the last few days, she'd stood on this road and thought idly that a wall here wouldn't hurt. She hadn't ordered it. She hadn't even meant it as more than a passing thought. It had built itself anyway, out of nothing but a mansion she'd wished for once, and a word that had apparently stuck. "It's the word," she muttered. "Mansion. It's not just a house. It's whatever I picture when I think it hard enough." Alfred looked at the barrier, then at her, and said nothing, which for Alfred counted as visibly alarmed. If the wall could build itself from an idle thought, farmland should be easy. Charlotte picked a vacant lot, planted her feet in front of an audience, hoping the new lord might actually feed them, and raised both arms the way she'd seen it done in every trashy fantasy novel she'd ever read. "Come out," she said. "Little people, now." Nothing happened. She tried again, louder, with a hand gesture for good measure. Still nothing. The dirt sat there, being dirt. Somewhere in the crowd, someone coughed in a way that sounded suspiciously like a laugh being swallowed. Alfred stepped in smoothly, telling the villagers the lady was simply testing the soil before committing resources, and that a planting schedule would follow shortly. It was a good save. She still felt every eye on her back the whole walk home, and by the time she reached her room, she'd stopped pretending the humiliation didn't sting. She slammed the door, threw herself face down on the mattress, and punched it twice for a goddess who wasn't there to feel it. She refused to sleep on principle. Sleeping felt like handing the day a win it hadn't earned. She lay there instead, glaring at the ceiling, replaying the silence in the village square until the glare softened into something heavier and her eyelids started losing the argument. That was when they came, one after another. Small shapes filed past the edge of her vision, close enough to touch, gone the instant her hand closed on empty air. She tried twice more. Both times her fingers passed through them like they were smoke that had learned to walk. She meant to ask them something. She meant to sit up and demand an explanation. Instead, the room tilted, the candle blurred into a smear of orange, and she was asleep before she finished the thought. Alfred woke her by shouting through the door, which had become something of a habit. "My lady, you need to see this." The lot she'd humiliated herself in front of the day before was unrecognizable. Every row was turned, level, and covered in black plastic sheeting, the exact kind she remembered from farms back home, the kind that kept weeds down and warmed the soil underneath. Nobody in this world had ever seen anything like it. Alfred kept repeating the word success, like it might wear out from use. Charlotte stood at the edge of the field and did the math out loud, mostly for her own benefit. Back at the church, she'd asked for the little people to work while she slept, so she could wake up and be surprised by it. The goddess had taken that literally, not as a preference, but as the only setting the whole system came with. "They only work when I'm out cold," she said. Alfred didn't quite hide a grin. That would explain the timing. It explained everything. The failed demonstration in front of a crowd, the overnight wall, the tilled field that showed up while she was busy losing an argument with her own pillow. She was furious about the design flaw, and underneath that, a little relieved to finally understand the rules of the thing. She called the villagers together properly this time, stood straight, and let them see the finished field before she said a word. "As you can see, the farmland is ready. Now it's up to you to work it." She promised no tax on the first harvest, on the condition they actually brought one in. An older man near the front started to answer, stumbled over the first word, and started again. "Ah, I'm Hitch," he managed. "Hitch, from today, you're leading the rest of them. My orders go through you." Keith, standing behind her, repeated the name back with a smirk that suggested he found it funnier than it was. Charlotte fixed him with a look flat enough to end the joke on its own. Hitch asked carefully what would feed everyone until the first harvest came in. She told him, work hard, and there'd be wheat and vegetables handed out along the way. He asked next about the black sheeting over the soil. She told him it was her magic, and that he only needed the results, not the details. By the time she finished, Hitch had teams sorted for the fields, the wheat, and the handful of livestock she'd had shipped in, organizing 30 confused, frightened villagers into something that finally looked like a working village instead of a waiting room for starvation. The next field she wanted was bigger, and she wasn't going to fail at it twice in front of an audience. She had Alfred lay his coat over the grass, sat down, closed her eyes, and let herself drift towards sleep on purpose this time. The little people showed up right on schedule, filing past her closing eyes in the same silent line as before. She reached for one anyway. Her hand went through it, same as always. Alfred's voice cut through, tight with something she hadn't heard from him before. "The ground is moving, all of it, as far as I can see. The weeds are just gone." He couldn't see them. He could only see what they left behind. Acres of dirt turning over in waves, cleared and leveled faster than any crew of men could manage in a season. Wheat wouldn't go in until autumn, so she settled on barley to fill the gap. Bread now, feed for the animals later. It wasn't glamorous. It was the first decision about her own land that had nothing to do with surviving the next 5 minutes, and that alone felt like progress. She'd gotten ambitious enough to try the mansion grounds themselves, dozing on a bench until flower beds and a low hedge grew in around the front steps overnight. It wasn't useful, exactly. It made her feel less like a savior and more like someone playing house, and she'd take it. Keith came sprinting through the middle of it, boots flattening 2 rows of the new hedge, before he skidded to a stop. "My lady, there's a structure around the whole settlement. It came up out of nowhere, and the villagers are asking questions I can't answer." "You just destroyed my garden to tell me that." Keith flinched. Sorry, I wanted to know what it was before I said anything. She was already walking past him toward the tree line before he finished apologizing. The barrier that had been 10 centimeters of curb along one road 3 weeks ago now stood at chest height and ran clean around the whole territory, disappearing over the horizon in both directions. When did I do this? Charlotte asked, mostly to herself. Alfred didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had lost its usual dry edge. Normally, a mage's power grows a little with every spell they cast. Yours has been doubling, every few days, doubling again, and you weren't even awake for most of it. So all that sleeping through the work business isn't just annoying. It's making me stronger. It's making you considerably stronger than is common for someone your age, or any age. She let that sit for a second, then let herself enjoy it, picturing, just for a moment, and only to herself, enough power to drag the goddess down out of the sky and make her answer for every single mistake in person. It was a nice thought. She filed it away and kept walking the line of her own wall instead, already wondering what else it could hold up. She'd pictured a proper gate for the wall, a single door, dark metal, swinging inward the way a room door would. One more night's sleep, and it was standing there exactly as she'd imagined it. The first thing she'd built on purpose, start to finish, without a single accident attached to it. She dragged Alfred out to see it before she'd even had breakfast. Well, she said, impressive, right? Alfred circled it once, ran a hand along the seam where it met the wall, and asked, who opens it? Someone will, and how will they know a visitor's arrived, since the South Road hasn't seen a cart in months? She didn't have an answer for that. He suggested, not unkindly, that they simply leave it open, since nobody was coming through it anyway. The pride she'd walked out here carrying deflated fast enough that she nearly missed what he said next, tossed in like an afterthought while he was still studying the hinge. For what it's worth, he said, I asked around, in my own roundabout way, how one even measures magic power. Nobody really does, but if I had to guess, yours already sits above mine, possibly in the top 5 in the capital. He said it lightly, already turning back toward the gate, as if it were a passing observation and not a fact that reorganized the entire kingdom's math. Charlotte didn't answer right away either. Nobody in the capital had any idea yet. She was standing in front of a gate nobody needed, behind a wall that had outgrown anyone's attention, holding more raw power than most of the nobles who ranked above her would ever hold. The wasteland hadn't just gotten a wall and a field. It had quietly become something considerably harder to write off. Leave the gate open then, she said. I've got other things to build. Other things to build, she'd said. 3 mornings later, walking her own barley rows with Alfred, Charlotte counted heads among the workers bent over the furrows and got the same number back every time. Nobody under 50. Alfred, how many of these people are under 30? He didn't need to check anything. None, my lady. And under 15? None of those either. She'd built a wall, a gate, and a field that fed itself. None of it meant anything in 20 years if the only hands working it belonged to people who wouldn't be alive to see the 20 years out. A territory needed young blood the way a fire needed wood, and hers had exactly none. There has to be somewhere people come from, she said. Somewhere that isn't here. Alfred considered that with the ledger tucked under one arm, the same way he considered everything he didn't want to promise too quickly. The villagers would know better than I would. They lived here before either of us did. Then let's ask them. After lunch, he said. Give me the morning to arrange it without it looking like an inspection. They still flinch when you walk fast. Hitch arrived with 4 others, and every one of them dropped to their knees the moment Charlotte stepped into the square. Stand up, she said, more tired than sharp. I'm not going to hit anyone for standing at normal height. They stood slowly, the way people stand when they don't entirely believe the offer is real. Alfred handled the rest of the settling in with a few quiet words, and Charlotte got to the question she actually wanted answered. Before I came here, did this village ever trade with anyone? Buy from anyone outside it? Hitch answered first, his voice catching before it steadied. When the village was new, my lady, we had money for it. Merchants used to come from Gertz County to the west, sold us what we couldn't grow ourselves. And then the funding stopped, and so did the merchants. It's been years since anyone came from outside. He hesitated, glancing at the man beside him before he kept going. Except there was one, a man from Gertz County. He arrived only a little while before you did, my lady. That stopped her cold. She'd assumed this whole time that the wasteland sat sealed off from the rest of the kingdom, that nobody in or out was simply how things were. It wasn't true. There was a road somewhere out there that people still walked, in at least one direction. Where is he now? Still here, working the fields with the rest of us. "Bring him to me," Charlotte said. "Now, if he can be spared." The man they brought her stood with his shoulders drawn in, sunburned hands twisting in front of him like he expected to be sent away the moment he finished talking. Charlotte told him to sit. He didn't, not at first, until Alfred repeated it as an order rather than a courtesy. His name was Mason. He'd farmed a strip of land in Gertz County until the spring floods took the farmhouse, the fields, and most of what he owned along with them. He'd walked west with nothing, hoping some lord somewhere still had work to spare. "I was going to keep walking," he said, "until someone would have me." "And if this village had had room for more than just you?" Charlotte asked. "Would you have gone back for the others?" He looked up at that, surprised the question had even occurred to her. "I'd have gone back the same day. There's a dozen of us at least who'd walk here tomorrow if there was anywhere to put them." Charlotte was already 3 steps ahead of the conversation, picturing rows of small houses, going up the way she remembered them going up back home. Quick, plain, functional. Alfred read her face and cut in before she could say any of it out loud. "No," he said. "I haven't said anything yet." Alfred's voice stayed level, but he set the ledger down, which was as close as he came to raising it. "You don't need to. My lady, you cannot simply recruit another lord's subjects. To Count Gertz, that reads as an act of hostility, the same as marching soldiers across his border. You are an exiled duke's daughter with no standing at court. If he decides to make an example of you, nobody will stop him. He's letting his own people starve in the meantime. That's not exactly a position of strength either. It doesn't have to be strength. It only has to be an excuse." Charlotte turned back to Mason, who'd gone very still, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. "You said you'd go back and invite them. Not that I'd send you to fetch them. That's the difference, Alfred. I'm not stealing his subjects out of his county. His subjects are choosing to leave on their own and telling their friends where to go after. I'm not lifting a finger past my own gate." Alfred opened his mouth, then closed it again. It took him a long moment to find the hole in that logic, and he never quite did. "That is," he said finally, "an extremely convenient reading of the law. It's still a reading of the law." Alfred spent 3 days quietly smoothing the ground before he brought her the man he'd found. Brett stood just inside the doorway, like the floor might give out beneath him, eyes fixed somewhere near her knees. "Yes, my lady," he said, to a question she hadn't finished asking. "I haven't asked anything yet." "Yes, my lady," he said again, and Charlotte had to stop herself from putting her head in her hands. Alfred stepped in, low and even. "Brett, Lady Charlotte genuinely means to bring your people here. She only needs to know what she's dealing with. Nobody's going to strike you for answering honestly." Something in Brett's shoulders came down half an inch. He admitted, in pieces, that he had 7 or 8 acquaintances back in Gertz County who'd leave the moment there was somewhere to go. Families mostly. A widower with a small child, a couple with none. And then, quieter, that 2 of the group were orphans with no family left to claim them, old enough to be noticed and young enough to have no way to protect themselves from whoever noticed first. "If nobody comes for them soon," Brett said, "they'll end up thieves, or worse. There's no honest way left for them to eat." Charlotte didn't need Alfred's warnings this time. "How far is it?" "Half a day's walk, my lady." "Then we're not waiting 3 days for a tidy list. Go back tonight. Anyone who can't survive the wait, you bring first, and you bring them now." Brett blinked like the order hadn't been the one he expected. "Yes, my lady," he said, and this time he meant it as an answer rather than a reflex. Walking half a day with children and no supplies wasn't a plan, it was a hope. Charlotte needed something faster than legs, and the only tool she had for building something faster than legs was sleep. She lay down under the tree, told Alfred she'd nap an hour or 2 at most, and pictured the one vehicle she remembered clearly enough to matter, a boxy little shuttle bus, the kind hotels ran between the airport and the lobby back in her old life. Sliding doors, enough seats for more than a dozen people. She held the image as hard as she could manage and let sleep take the rest. The little people came the way they always did, filing past the edge of her closing vision, indifferent to her the same as ever. She reached toward one out of habit more than hope, and for the first time, her fingers actually brushed something solid before it moved past her. She didn't have time to wonder what that meant. Sleep took the rest of the thought with it. Alfred woke her by shouting through the garden, "My lady, there is something outside that I cannot explain." The something was a squat, dark blue vehicle with sliding doors on one side and a row of windows down its length, parked in the middle of the front grounds like it had always belonged there. Along its flank ran a line of block lettering in a language nobody in this world could read. Some hotel chain from a life only she remembered, stamped there for reasons the little people clearly hadn't bothered to consider. "It's a carriage," Charlotte said, "the kind that doesn't need horses." Alfred touched the side of it like it might bite him. "It's making a sound. That's the engine idling. It's meant to do that." She climbed in, found the key already sitting on the dashboard exactly where she'd have expected one, and pulled the vehicle in a slow loop around the grounds to prove the thing actually moved. A villager crossing the yard with a bucket dropped it entirely and ran the other way. Alfred, riding in the seat beside her with both hands braced on the dash, went from rigid to delighted somewhere around the second turn. "This is extraordinary," he said, forgetting for once to sound calm about anything. "It seats 14, enough for Brett's whole list, with room left over." She parked it, climbed out, and was already giving orders before her feet hit the ground. "Get Brett! We leave within the hour." Alfred's delight dimmed a shade. "You intend to drive this yourself? Into Gertz County. I intend to drive it to the edge of Gertz County. That's close enough." He didn't argue. He went to get Brett instead, which she took as agreement. Brett rode up front beside Charlotte, both hands gripping the seat like it might buck him off, calling out directions in a voice that kept climbing half an octave whenever the vehicle picked up speed. She held it around 40, then let it drift past 60 without quite meaning to, until Alfred asked her, evenly, to notice what her own foot was doing. They stopped short of the walled settlement Brett pointed out, a huddle of low buildings behind a wall Charlotte guessed at 3 meters, one gate on the south side, and no one standing watch on the wall itself. Close enough to reach on foot, far enough that nobody inside would see the vehicle that brought her. She spent a few minutes teaching Brett which handle opened the sliding door from outside and which one worked from in, since he'd need to manage it himself on the way back. Alfred and Keith each took a turn at it too, sliding the door open and shut with the careful concentration of men handling something that might be sacred. A carriage that moves itself, with no visible horses and no visible driver's skill required, Alfred said, low, once Brett had gone ahead toward the gate. "If word of this reaches the wrong court, it will draw exactly the kind of attention I've spent every day since we left the capital trying to keep away from you. Then I'll need enough power that the attention doesn't matter," Charlotte said. "I'd rather be a problem nobody wants to start than a secret somebody eventually finds." Keith, listening from the backseat, asked whether she wanted a full count taken of the settlement's people while they waited, in case more of them were worth remembering for later. She told him yes, quietly, and to keep it to himself for now. Then there was nothing to do but wait, the lights sliding lower over the wall, the road behind them empty in both directions. Brett came back through the gate with more people behind him than Charlotte had let herself expect, a straggling line that kept unspooling long after she thought it had ended. 32, once someone finally counted. Families holding whole rows of small hands. A widower carrying a child too tired to walk. 2 teenagers standing slightly apart from everyone else, watching the vehicle with the particular wariness of people who'd learned not to trust anything offered for free. None of them had shoes. None of them carried more than what fit in their own 2 arms. Charlotte stood at the open door and watched the fear on their faces do something she recognized from a much smaller mirror. The exact moment someone realizes the worst hasn't happened yet and doesn't quite dare believe it. She'd worn that same look once, in a different life, in a garden she hadn't chosen either. "Everyone who can fit, get in," she said. "The rest of you walk behind us. Nobody's being left on this road tonight." Brett hovered near her, visibly bracing for anger at the size of the group he'd brought. "I told them 3 days, my lady, but they said they couldn't wait that long. I hope I didn't." "You did exactly what I asked you to do." She meant it plainly enough that he heard it. "Good work, Brett. Better than good." He went red to the ears and said nothing else, which suited him better than any thanks he might have tried to put into words. They loaded who they could, mothers with the smallest children first, then the widower, then as many of the rest as the seats allowed. The remainder fell into step behind the vehicle's slow crawl, and Charlotte kept the speed down to a walking pace the whole way home rather than leave a single one of them behind in the dark. By the time they reached the gate, word had already run ahead of them. Hitch had villagers up and moving, dragging tables into the square, ladling out whatever the kitchens had on hand before Charlotte had even finished parking the vehicle. Nobody had ordered any of it. They'd simply looked at the 32 strangers filing in behind her and started cooking. Charlotte walked the length of the square while bowls went out, one after another, into hands too tired to hold them steady. A little girl near the end of the line stared at her bowl like she expected someone to take it back. Charlotte crouched down until they were eye level. "That's yours," she said. "All of it. Nobody's taking it from you." The girl ate like she believed her. By midnight, there were blankets laid out in the old storehouse for anyone still without a roof, a head count taken twice to be sure nobody had been missed on the road, and 32 people asleep in her territory who'd started the day with nothing and no reason to expect that would change. Alfred found her afterward, standing at the edge of the square with the noise finally starting to settle. 32, he said. Count Gertz has 32 fewer mouths to feed tonight and doesn't know it yet. He'll notice eventually. He will, and when he does, it won't read as 32 desperate people choosing to leave. It will read as you taking them. Then we'll deal with that when it happens. She watched the last lantern get carried into the storehouse, the light shrinking, the square finally going quiet. Tonight, they have a floor and a meal. That's the part I get to feel good about. The rest of it can wait its turn. Alfred didn't argue. For once, he didn't have anything dry left to say either. The banging started before dawn, and Alfred's shouting started about 10 minutes after that. He found her half asleep and informed her, far too loudly for the hour, that the little people had spent the night finishing enough clothes to surprise everyone, and had instead produced enough to clothe the whole territory twice over, stacked floor to ceiling in the front hall. She told him that was a problem for after breakfast, and went to look at the more interesting one, the houses. 9 of them had come up out of the ground since yesterday. Brick where there had been mud and thatch, glass in the window frames, a carved nameplate by every door. Small dignities none of these families had owned in their lives. Keith had already sorted the new arrivals into work by whatever they used to do before Gertz County fell apart. Farmers back to farming, a former merchant handed a hoe and told he would learn. The 2 teenage orphans put in charge of minding the smaller children instead of minding each other. Ambitious, Alfred said, catching up to her at the 3rd house, sounding like a man who had stopped being surprised by any of this 2 renovations ago. Though none of them have furniture yet. They will by supper. She was already walking toward the well, where the little people had started framing a bathhouse around the water faster than she could cross the square twice to check on them. Sorting the clothing mountain took the rest of the morning. She had already given the order that mattered more. Soap, normally kept for nobles alone, was theirs to use at the new bathhouse for as long as they needed it, and every stitch of the rags they had arrived in was to be burned rather than washed and kept. Nobody argued with either instruction twice. Getting the refugees to stop bowing every time she walked past took longer than the sorting did. She told the widower with the 2 boys, plainly, to sit back down the first 3 times he tried to stand for her. By the 4th, she had stopped counting. That was when Alfred found her, arms full of folded shirts, and delivered his report in the flat, careful tone he used when he already knew she would not like it. "They've started calling you a saint," he said. "Not just the new families. Hitch said it this morning like it was already settled fact." Charlotte kept folding. "Tell them to stop." "I did. It didn't take." She did not answer right away. A saint did not lose her temper at slow servants. A saint did not count coins twice out of habit instead of trust. Sooner or later, somebody was going to notice she was neither patient nor holy. And the fall from saint was a great deal further than the fall from decent landlord who feeds people. She kept that thought to herself, told Alfred to have the nameplates finished by evening, and went back to counting shirts. The next stranger to reach her gate came with a cart of goods and a smile that had clearly been practiced in a mirror. He introduced himself as Dorn, a merchant working out of Gertz County, come to reopen trade after what he called the long, regrettable silence between their territories. He waited to be told to sit. He complimented the mansion, the weather, and her magic, in that order, before she had said more than 6 words to him. Charlotte had grown up around enough flattery to know its shape on a stranger. Gertz County had not sent a single trader her way in the whole time she had held this land. And now, weeks after 32 of the Count's own people had vanished from his fields overnight, one arrived unannounced with a full cart and a story about missing her. She thanked him for his patience and told him she would look over his wares shortly, then had Alfred walk him out to wait in the garden. Mason was still wiping flour off his hands when Alfred brought him in. "Never seen him," he said, once Charlotte had described the merchant waiting in the garden. "I knew every trader worth knowing who came through Gertz County. Whoever that is out there, he isn't one of them." That settled it. A merchant who was not a merchant, arriving days after the Count's missing subjects would have been noticed, already asking after her wall before he had even unpacked his cart. Nobody needed to say the word spy out loud for all 3 of them to be thinking it. Arresting him outright would hand Count Gertz exactly the excuse he wanted. Better to send him home with a full report and the wrong idea of who he had been dealing with. Then, let's give him something to write down. Charlotte went to change into something considerably more ridiculous. She came back out with Keith carrying a coin bag heavy enough that he needed both arms for it, and let it land on Dorn's display table with a thud loud enough to make his eyebrows lift half an inch. He had priced his carrots at 5 copper each, claiming a subsidy shortage back home. Hitch, close enough to overhear, mouthed the real number at her. 2 copper, same as it had always been. Charlotte did not call Dorn a liar. She simply asked sweetly why a subsidy shortage in Gertz County should cost her twice the usual price, then bought his entire cart and argued him down to 1 copper a carat before he had finished protesting. He recovered fast enough to ask about the wall, nodding at the pale, silver-flecked barrier ringing the village like it belonged to a much larger, much older lord. Charlotte let herself preen. "That's my magic," she said, delighted with herself in exactly the way a spoiled child would be. "I had it made shiny on purpose. Looks stronger from a distance that way, doesn't it?" Dorn agreed that it certainly did, with the particular carefulness of a man revising every note he planned to send home. She kept haggling him down on the rest of his goods out of sheer enjoyment, and sent him off that evening with a full purse of her coin, an empty cart, and precisely the wrong impression of everything he had seen. Alone that night, she let herself think the thought she usually saved for the edge of sleep. She still did not actually know whether the story that was supposed to kill her had been canceled or only delayed. Nothing in the last handful of months had proven it either way. She fell asleep before she could decide which answer frightened her less. 2 days after Dorn's cart rolled out of sight, a very different kind of trouble rolled in. Vince arrived with 4 royal guards and the settled confidence of a man who had never once been told no. He was heavyset, richly dressed for a visit to a territory that could barely feed itself, and unimpressed by everything he saw, starting with the fact that no one had offered him tea. Alfred, stationed by the door, kept his own face carefully, formally blank. He had come, he informed her, for a tax inspection, and made a point of remarking on the plain reception room, the lack of refreshments, and the general poverty of a lord too young to know better than to receive a royal official so shabbily. Charlotte reminded him, as politely as she could manage, that a territory whose last drought had nearly emptied it of the living was not likely to have much left over for the crown, let alone for his tea. He did not care. He had been sent to collect, and collect he would, regardless of what he found when he got here. That was when Keith burst through the door without knocking, out of breath, reporting that the North Forest had gone strange, trees shaking, ground trembling, something large and fast coming toward the village from the tree line. Vince's composure lasted about 4 seconds past the word monster. He was on his feet demanding the gate opened for his own escape before Charlotte had finished pointing out that the village's only real protection was the 2 knights he was about to take with him. She let him panic a while longer before she made her offer. His knights would open the gate and let him leave immediately in exchange for one small favor. He would report to the capital that this territory had nothing left worth taxing. He agreed before she had finished the sentence. Then, prompted a second time, dropped a pouch of coin on the table as well. A donation, she informed him, that his own guards had just watched him make, should anyone ever ask. He did not wait to hear whether she was joking. His knights swept him out through the gate at a run, leaving her, Alfred, and Keith to face whatever was coming through the trees. 2 strangers in 2 weeks, both convinced this backwater was worth something. Neither of them knew the half of it. By the time they reached the north wall, half the village had gathered to watch. Hitch, who had the sharpest eyes in the territory, had already climbed a ladder too short to reach the top and was shouting down descriptions no one at the bottom could quite picture. Dozens of horn rabbits, then dozens more, running in one panicked mass straight at the wall. Keith went up after him. Alfred followed. Charlotte, 8 years old and considerably shorter than either of them, was left standing at the base of a 5-meter wall with no ladder and no way up, listening to the rumble get louder and trying to remember whether she had ever actually tested this wall against anything bigger than weather. She need not have worried. The impact, when it came, sounded less like a battle and more like a very large, very final piece of furniture being dropped from a great height, followed by silence. Alfred's laugh drifted down from the top of the wall a moment later. "They're all dead," he called down. "Every last one of them. Ran straight into it, and that was that." He and Keith climbed over to deal with the bodies, taking the ladder with them and leaving Charlotte exactly where she had started, alone at the bottom of her own wall, with no way back to the mansion. By full dark, the square smelled like roasting meat for the first time anyone there could remember. Horn rabbit, it turned out, was a delicacy nobody in the mansion had known to expect. Juicy and rich, worth the trouble of the pile of carcasses that had made Charlotte's stomach turn a few hours earlier. Hitch had the tables and torches arranged before she had even finished washing up, and by the time she walked out into the square, half the village was already seated. Refugees and old old residents mixed together at the same long tables for the first time since either group had arrived. She gave a short speech, mostly to settle the nerves of the families who had never seen a magical beast before that afternoon. The wall had held, she told them. It would keep holding. Whatever came out of that forest next, it would meet the same wall the horn rabbits had, and nobody in this village needed to lie awake over it. Then she sat down and ate more of the meat than she meant to admit later. While Alfred poured wine he claimed to have an endless supply of, and told anyone who would listen that his lady had gone from saint to goddess in one afternoon. "Don't start," she said, around a mouthful she should have chewed first. Wouldn't dream of it. He refilled his own cup instead of answering, and left it at that. Around them, men who had been strangers a season ago traded stories with men who had lived here their whole lives. A boy who had arrived barefoot and silent 3 weeks earlier was laughing hard enough to choke on his bread. For one night, the only thing that mattered at that table was that there was enough food for everyone to have seconds, and that the wall she had built out of spite and necessity had turned out to be exactly as good as she had hoped. She stayed until the torches burned low, and left only when Alfred pointed out, gently, that some of these people actually had to work in the morning. Back in her own room, mind still running through wall repairs and grain counts, she let herself drift towards sleep the way she always did when she wanted the little people to appear. And this time, half conscious, she reached toward the shape flickering at the edge of the candlelight and actually caught one by the arm. It did not vanish. It did not pull away. It simply stood there, solid and still under her hand, waiting. "Can you hear me?" she whispered. "Nothing. Say something. Anything. Turn right if you understand me." It did not turn right. It did not do anything at all, and after a long minute, she let go, more unsettled by the silence than she wanted to admit. Whatever these things were, they were not taking orders from her in real time, only the ones she gave them before she fell asleep. That was a problem for a day when she had the patience to solve it. Tomorrow, she decided, she was finally riding out to the church to have a very overdue conversation with the goddess. She did not get the chance. Alfred's voice tore through the door before the sun had properly cleared the horizon, in the exact tone that meant whatever came next was going to ruin her morning. "Young lady, young lady," Alfred's shout had already crossed 2 hallways by the time Charlotte cracked one eye open. Given the hour and the volume, she assumed the eastern wall had finally come down, or the goblins had worked up the nerve to try the front gate instead of just rattling the fence at night. She'd earned the extra sleep either way. 3 straight nights of holding that wall together, while something with too many teeth tested every seam in it, had left her flattened in a way no amount of tea could fix. It was neither. The door banged open. Alfred stood in it, hair uncombed, in his socks, looking like a man who had sprinted the length of the house in them, which, she noted, he had. "We have a guest," he said, "at this hour. Princess Flap." Charlotte sat up so fast the room tilted. For one groggy second, she genuinely believed she'd misheard him. "The princess," she repeated. "Here, now. Arrived roughly 20 minutes ago. No warning, no escort banner, no letter sent ahead. Just her, one attendant, one steward, and a guard small enough to fit in a single carriage." Alfred was already hauling her wardrobe open with the brisk efficiency of a man solving a structural emergency rather than a social one. "She's waiting in the reception room. From what I've gathered in the last 20 minutes, she's already charmed the kitchen staff into refilling her tea twice." Charlotte swung her legs out of bed and started doing the math on how badly this could go, because a crown princess showing up unannounced at the door of a girl her own father had thrown away over a public scandal was not a friendly visit. It was a live grenade wearing a party dress, and somebody had left it on her doorstep before breakfast. Mia arrived before Charlotte had both boots on, arms full of every dress the household owned that wasn't currently doing service as a rag. Which one? Pink was out on principle. The princess practically glowed pink these days. Literally, it turned out, since light magic apparently came with its own built-in halo, and Charlotte had no interest in showing up looking like a match set with the girl whose visit might get her accused of treason before lunch. She pointed at the pale blue instead. Mia's hands weren't quite steady on the laces, and Charlotte didn't blame her. A princess sitting in the good chair downstairs was enough to rattle anyone in this house, herself included. She had her laced in under 2 minutes flat, working faster than the dress deserved credit for. Somewhere in the middle of it, Charlotte caught her own reflection, hastily brushed hair, a dress that fit better than anything she'd owned before the exile, and an expression doing its very best impression of composed. It would have to do. She didn't have time to make it convincing, and there wasn't a version of this morning where convincing was actually on the table. Keith's voice rang out from the doorway like he was announcing a coronation instead of one very tired girl in a borrowed color. "Lady Charlotte has arrived." She stepped in, sank into a curtsy her body remembered better than her mind did, and got her first real look at Princess Flap. The rumors were not exaggerated. The princess sat perfectly composed on the only good chair the room owned, haloed in a soft, steady gold light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Pink-tinted hair catching it like she'd been lit for a portrait nobody had asked to paint. Behind her chair stood two figures Charlotte hadn't been briefed on, a stiff, scowling attendant planted by the door like a second lock, and a calmer, older steward who looked like he'd spent his whole career mopping up after other people's good intentions. There was supposed to be a specific opening line for greeting royalty, something about the sun, a phrase every noble child memorized before they could walk properly. Charlotte had never bothered learning it, even in her old life, and she certainly wasn't relearning it now for an audience she hadn't asked for. She skipped straight to the part she could actually manage. "I am Charlotte," she said, straightening out of the curtsy. "Lord of this village, forgive the poor hospitality. We don't often receive guests of your station." It should have ended there. It did not, because Alfred, standing a precise half step behind her, cleared his throat. "Your Highness should know," he said gravely, "that Charlotte has spent years now in this remote and difficult posting, far from everything she once had, without complaint." Charlotte shot him a look that promised a reckoning later. He did not so much as blink, taking the hint for a cue rather than a threat. She laid it on considerably thicker than she'd planned to. "Forgive me further. I have no sweets to offer a guest of your rank, no proper dress for the occasion, only what little this village can spare. I reflect daily on the conduct that brought me here, and I'm prepared to accept whatever judgment you think fit." It was, by a wide margin, the most pathetic sentence she had ever constructed on purpose. It worked exactly as intended. The princess's eyes brimmed instantly. "Charlotte, how pitiable." She caught herself a beat later, composing her face back into something more princess-shaped. "The same age as me, exiled with no one to look after you. I've forgotten the tea party entirely, you know. I can't believe the adults made such a production of it. I asked father for leniency afterward. He wouldn't hear it, but I haven't given up. I'll keep asking until he listens." Which was almost touching, and also the exact moment Charlotte's stomach dropped clean through the floor. Because there was only one reason an unmarried princess showed up alone at an exiled noble's door before sunrise, with no formal escort and no letter sent ahead. She'd left without permission. She confirmed it a breath later, cheerfully, like it was a charming detail rather than a diplomatic disaster. She'd slipped out of the palace before dawn, left a note behind saying she'd be back soon, and come all this way specifically to check on Charlotte herself. Behind her, the attendant's scowl deepened another degree. He did not look nearly so charmed by the confession. She ran through the short list of ways this could end. If the princess left quickly, quietly, and nobody outside this house heard about it, the whole visit would simply not have happened. As far as the capital was concerned, the safest outcome by a wide margin. If it went any other way, there were at least 3 separate stories currently available for anyone with a grudge to tell. That she'd lured the princess here, detained her, or somehow used her magic to influence a member of the royal family. None of them were true. None of them needed to be true to cause damage. All she could actually control was how fast this ended and how ordinary she made it look while it did. Alfred, unbothered as ever, plowed straight into the exact question a career diplomat would spend an hour working up to. "Your Highness plans to stay the night then? This house isn't equipped for a proper guest room, but we could manage something." The attendant cut him off before the princess could answer, informing them flatly that Her Highness would be departing immediately. No accommodations needed, in a tone that made clear he found the very suggestion faintly insulting. Small mercies, Charlotte thought. If they stayed even one night, whatever this was would stop being an accident and start being an incident with witnesses and a timeline. She had exactly as much time as it took to have that thought before the princess made it worse. She brightened suddenly, like she'd invented fire. "Why don't you just come back with me, right now? I'll tell father it's already decided." The room went very quiet. Alfred's composure cracked for one visible second, eyebrows up, mouth open, the closest thing to open panic Charlotte had ever seen on him in front of an audience. Behind the princess, the attendant's face did something complicated and furious, and he took a half step forward, like a man genuinely considering intervening in a diplomatic incident with his own 2 hands. It took the steward exactly 2 seconds to recover. He inserted himself neatly between the sentence and its consequences. "Since your Highness has now confirmed with her own eyes that Lady Fitzgerald is in good health and good spirits, perhaps it's time to return to the capital, where your father is no doubt already worried." Charlotte had never been so grateful for a man she'd known for under 2 minutes, because what the princess had just offered, undoing her father's exile exile decree, out loud, unilaterally, without so much as a signature, was not kindness. It was a lit match held an inch from a building made entirely of dry paperwork. If word got out that the princess had tried to overturn a Fitzgerald family judgment on a whim, during a visit nobody had authorized, it wouldn't just endanger Charlotte. It would make her look complicit, as though she'd engineered the whole scene to angle for exactly this outcome. She kept her face perfectly still and said none of that out loud. Keith reappeared at the door before the steward had finished herding the princess toward it, considerably less composed than the announcement version of himself. "The king's messenger," he said. "He's found them." A man in royal colors strode in a moment later, road dust still on his boots, and dropped to one knee in front of the princess, with the particular relief of someone who had spent the whole morning terrified of exactly this outcome. He'd been sent out at dawn, it turned out, after the princess's party failed to appear at the meeting point they'd promised the night before, and had traced them here, to a border village nobody in the capital could have pointed to on a map, on nothing but a hunch and the note the princess had left behind. The king, the messenger admitted under a little prompting, had nearly called out half the royal guard when her absence was first discovered, a detail that did not make Charlotte feel better about anything. The princess had the decency to look mildly guilty about it. "I only wanted to see for myself that she was all right," she said, to the messenger, to the room, to no one in particular. "I'm sorry for the trouble, truly." It was the first thing she'd said all morning that Charlotte fully believed. The messenger didn't look inclined to argue with the princess in front of witnesses, but his expression made his opinion of the morning's events clear enough without a single word of it needing translation. Within minutes, the whole party was in motion. Attendant, steward, guard, princess funneled out the door with the brisk, relieved efficiency of people who badly wanted this entire visit to have never happened in the first place. Charlotte walked them out herself, because appearances mattered even now, and stood in the yard while the carriage was brought around. She caught only the tail end of what the princess murmured to her attendant just before the carriage door shut. Something about not needing to worry over her anymore. Not really a threat now, was she? And didn't need to hear the rest to understand the verdict. Filed under harmless, filed under handled, filed under not worth the trip, though clearly not enough of a reason to have skipped this one. Charlotte watched the carriage until the dust settled and the road sat empty again, and found she didn't much care. Being underestimated by a princess who glowed for a living ranked fairly low on her personal list of problems, somewhere below goblins and well above the tax collector. "Well," Alfred said beside her, "that happened." "That happened," she agreed. Neither of them moved for a moment. The yard had just held the single most dangerous visitor of Charlotte's short political career, and now it was only a yard again. By the time they were back inside, the nerve that had carried her through the entire performance drained out of her all at once, like someone had pulled a plug. She sat down in the nearest chair, not gracefully, and stayed there. She thought, not for the first time, about the life she used to have, and about how thoroughly she'd been running on nothing but momentum since waking up in this one. Every stretch of time since the tea party had been one long sprint. Survive the exile, survive the magic she hadn't asked for, survive the wall, survive the refugees, survive a suspicious merchant and a panicking tax collector, and now survive a princess who meant well and had nearly gotten her accused of holding the crown hostage before noon. She hadn't stopped long enough to notice how tired that made a person, not until she finally sat still and let it catch up with her all at once. Alfred didn't say anything for a while. He just poured her a cup of tea she hadn't asked for and set it down close enough that she'd have to make an effort not to drink it, which was, she'd learned by now, his specific way of checking on a person without making it sound like checking on a person. He studied her for a long moment, head tilted, the way he did when something about her wasn't adding up. "Milady," he said finally, "you've gone very quiet. Were you purified? Light magic does that, apparently. Burns the venom right out of a person." "I have had," Charlotte muttered, eyes still closed, "the single strangest morning of my life, and you want to make jokes. So, no purification then." "Say that again and find out." A pause. Then, with visible relief, "Ah, there she is, back to normal." She let herself have exactly one more minute of sitting very still before she made herself get up. There was a wall to check on, grain to argue about, and a village that didn't run itself just because a princess had decided to make her morning difficult. Word travels faster than any royal seal can stop it, and this particular story had a head start. The inn staff who had hosted the princess's party the night before talked. The guards who had escorted the messenger talked. An attendant who couldn't resist a good story at his own dinner table that evening talked loudest of all. Nobody involved had meant any harm by it. Nobody involved needed to. By the time the story reached the capital, it had grown into something better than what had actually happened, the way stories do when enough hands pass them along. In drawing rooms lit by too many candles and loosened by too much wine, over cards and correspondence, and idle afternoons with nothing better to discuss, one detail kept resurfacing above the rest. Princess Flap herself, heir to the throne, light-blessed and impossible to fake sympathy from, had slipped her own guard in the middle of the night, specifically to check on the Fitzgerald girl everyone had quietly agreed to forget, the worthless one. The one exiled as a child over a scandal nobody quite remembered the particulars of anymore, only that it had ended with her banished and disowned. The one Duke Fitzgerald had cast out to a border village with no title, no allowance, and, everyone had assumed, without ever checking, no future worth discussing. It didn't hurt that a second rumor had already been drifting toward the capital for weeks. The same exiled girl had taken in dozens of refugees with nowhere else to go, and they'd started calling her something between a landlord and a saint. On its own, that story hadn't traveled far. Paired with a princess's personal concern, it stopped being a curiosity and became a pattern. One matron was overheard saying she'd always thought it strange how quickly the Fitzgeralds had moved past the whole affair. Someone else wondered aloud, just barely quiet enough to be repeated by morning, why a girl capable of impressing minor royalty and sheltering the desperate had been sent somewhere with no name on any map worth owning, which raised overcards over wine, in the particular quiet cruelty that polite society reserves for a question it already suspects the answer to. What kind of father exiles a daughter capable of drawing the crown princess's own personal concern? Nobody confronted the Duke over it. Nobody wrote to a magistrate or demanded an inquiry, or did anything so direct as accuse a sitting duke of cruelty to his face. It wasn't justice, it was gossip, traded by people who had never met Charlotte and would likely forget the finer details of her again within a season. But gossip was its own kind of currency in the capital, and for the first time in years, it had started spending against the Fitzgerald name instead of for it. By the third retelling, someone had added that the princess wept at the sight of Charlotte's threadbare household. By the fifth, someone else had decided the princess meant to petition for her full reinstatement outright. Neither detail was true. Both were repeated as settled fact within the same week, because a story people want to believe rarely waits around for confirmation. The report reached Duke Fitzgerald already stripped of half its context and doubled in size, the way these things always were by the time they survived the trip from a drawing room to a duke's private study. He read it once, standing at his own desk. Then he read it again, more slowly, as though a second pass might change what it said. His daughter, the one he'd struck in front of witnesses at a tea party months ago and shipped off to rot in a border village, specifically so the family would never have to discuss her again. Somehow standing at the center of a rumor that made him look to every rival house watching for exactly this kind of opening, either cruel or foolish, possibly both. For one unguarded moment, the fury in him wasn't really about the princess, or the visit, or even Charlotte at all. It was the sharp, private humiliation of a man who had spent years building a wall of silence around one inconvenient daughter, only to discover that the wall had a hole in it he'd never known to guard, and that he'd learned of it from a letter, secondhand, well after the fact, with no way left to put anything back the way it had been. He set the letter down very carefully, the way a man sets down something he would much rather throw across the room. There was no one in the study to shout at, no decree he could issue that would unring a bell already being rung in a dozen drawing rooms at once. The story was moving through the capital without his permission and without his knowledge until it was far too late to stop. And for the first time since he'd signed her exile papers, Duke Fitzgerald discovered there was nothing at all he could do about his own daughter. He would find something to do eventually. A favor called in, a rumor of his own set loose to compete with this one. Some maneuver that would take weeks to arrange and longer still to matter. Tonight, he had nothing but the letter, the lamp, and the unfamiliar, uncomfortable sensation of losing a fight. He hadn't realized he was in until it was already over. None of it reached Charlotte. 2 counties away and several days behind, she spent that particular afternoon on top of her own wall, arguing with Keith about grain quotas. "You're wrong about the northern field," Keith said, not for the first time that week. "I am extremely right about the northern field. "You are extremely stubborn about the northern field." She let him have that one, since arguing against it would have proven his point. Somewhere in the capital, at that exact hour, her name was the most interesting thing anyone had discussed in a season, and she had absolutely no idea. The wall held, the rumor spread. Somewhere in between the two, without her doing a single thing to cause it, the first crack had opened in a reputation her father had spent years carefully building, and neither of them knew it yet. 3 months into ruling as Countess, Charlotte stood at the edge of the eastern field and looked at a problem she'd never expected to have. Too much food. Cabbage, pumpkin, eggplant, cucumber, spinach. The first true harvest her territory had ever produced, rows of it stretching further than she could see. Whole sections were rotting where they stood because nobody could get to them fast enough. A season ago, this same ground had been dead dirt nobody wanted. Now it was drowning in the exact opposite problem, and she found she didn't hate that particular irony one bit. Hitch found her there, hat in both hands, looking like a man delivering news he still didn't quite believe was bad. Every worker in the territory was already in the fields from dawn to dark, he told her, and it still wasn't enough. They'd managed the early spring crop by splitting shifts, rotating families through in relays. Now, at full peak, the harvest was simply outrunning every hand they had, and produce was going soft in baskets before anyone could carry it in. Alfred leaned against the fence post and didn't bother hiding a smile. "A labor shortage," he said. "That's new. Usually it's a monster, or a tax collector, or an unannounced princess. I'll have the extra hands you need by tomorrow morning," Charlotte told Hitch, and watched him blink like she'd switched languages on him mid-sentence. "You don't have anyone to send for," Alfred said. "No contacts, no coin for it, no time." "I didn't say I was sending for anyone." Keith arrived just in time to catch the tail end of that, and his face did the thing it always did lately, sparkling, expectant, the look of a man who'd learned the hard way what happened after she said something like that. Alfred didn't push it further. 3 months of being proven wrong had taught him when to stop asking how and start bracing for what came next. "Tell everyone the new labor starts tomorrow," she told Hitch. "I'm going to take a nap. Nobody opens my door until I say so." She left both men staring after her, matching looks of barely restrained anticipation on their faces, and allowed herself a small, private smile the whole walk back to the manor. Being underestimated had stopped stinging months ago. Now it was almost fun. Charlotte had a plan, and the plan had a name from a life that technically didn't belong to her anymore. Delivery robots? The low, boxy little carts used to zip through restaurant floors back home, weaving between tables with a bowl of noodles balanced on top. They were low enough that even the smallest kid working the counter could load one without straining. Their sturdier cousins hauled packages down the halls of high-rise apartment towers, patient and tireless, in a way no hired hand ever managed to be. She'd found both mildly annoying in her old life. Funny how badly she wanted them now. She sketched the shape in her head, a cart bed low enough for a child to load, a solar panel angled up top to keep it charged through the long summer days. Standardized containers would stack 2 and 3 high without sliding. 50 of them, she decided. 50 felt right for a harvest this size. She called the little people to get started. Nothing happened. She called again. Still nothing. A shape flickered at the edge of the room and she lunged for it. Her hand closed on empty air. One little leader finally popped into view, refusing point blank to meet her eyes, and the rest of them gathered behind him in a silent, unmoving huddle, watching her the way a crowd watches someone about to lose their temper in public. "Why aren't you working?" No answer. She stamped her foot, which accomplished nothing beyond making her foot hurt. Every one of the little people tilted their heads at the exact same angle in the exact same instant, like she'd asked the question in a language none of them spoke, which, she realized, was more or less what had happened. Talking had never really been how this worked, not for anything this specific. Broad concepts, sure. A wall, a road, a house, those landed fine on plain instruction. But a machine with moving parts and a route to learn needed more than words could carry. So she stopped explaining and just showed them instead. The apartment towers, the restaurant carts, the containers stacking neatly. The whole design laid out at once like a picture pinned behind her own eyes and held there until every last one of them had seen it clearly. That they understood. All 50 peeled away and got to work at once, and Charlotte, feeling unreasonably proud of a method of communication she'd only just invented on the spot, dropped onto her bed already half asleep. The last coherent thought she managed before the exhaustion took her under was aimed squarely at the goddess, and none of it was polite. She woke up on the floor. That part wasn't new. Magic always seemed to leave her a few feet from wherever she'd started, like it resented being asked for anything overnight. What was new was Alfred slamming her door open without knocking, something he hadn't done since the week they'd first arrived. "Miss!" He was already crossing the room. "How many times have I told you not to come in?" She started, out of pure reflex, and he talked straight over her, which told her more than his actual words did. "You need to see this. Now!" She got to the window in her nightclothes, hair a disaster, still half convinced this was going to be something small. It took about 2 seconds standing there to understand exactly what kind of morning she'd actually woken up into. 50 robots were loose in the territory, and every one of them was moving roughly 3 times faster than she'd designed them to. The speed limit she'd set without thinking twice, back when this had all been theoretical, was 30 kilometers an hour. What she was watching now was closer to 60, and in the case of one particularly enthusiastic unit barreling straight down the main road, closer to 90, a boxy cart, its solar panel jutting up at an angle that made it look, absurdly, like it was wearing a pharaoh's crown, screaming past a fence line so fast it left a wake of scattered chickens and one very offended goat behind it. Another cart had somehow wedged itself sideways across the road, wheels still spinning. A second one swerved around it and clipped a fence post instead, sending splinters into the air like confetti. A third rolled straight through somebody's vegetable patch, flattening a week of tender new sprouts under its wheels without slowing down even slightly. The noise alone was enormous. Engines whining, gravel spraying, somewhere a dog barking itself hoarse at something it clearly considered a personal enemy. Villagers scattered in every direction. A woman threw herself and her child bodily into a ditch. An old man dropped his walking stick and simply ran, faster than Charlotte would have guessed a man his age could move. Somewhere below, somebody was shouting the word cart over and over, like it was also a curse word, and getting no answers, because carts did not, in fact, respond to shouting. Charlotte threw the window open and put everything she had into one word. "Stop!" 50 robots screeched to a dead halt in the same instant, brakes shrieking loud enough to hurt, containers sliding half off their beds and clattering onto the road, dust rolling forward in a wave that reached the front gate before finally settling into a haze over the whole street. Silence dropped in behind it, thick and sudden. Somewhere in it, the offended goat registered its opinion one more time, just to be thorough. Alfred looked at the sudden stillness, then at her, then back at the 50 motionless carts steaming gently in the morning light. "That's better," he said, in the flat tone of a man who'd simply run out of room for more surprise that morning. By the time she made it outside, containers stood stacked in neat, oddly cheerful towers at the front gate. The one thing the robots had apparently done right on their own initiative, while the carts themselves sat scattered across the yard and the road beyond like toys dropped mid-tantrum, a few still ticking as their frames cooled. The villagers gathered at a careful distance weren't reassured by neat containers. A mother stood with her crying son pressed into her skirts, watching the nearest cart the way people watch something that might still bite. Behind her, an older woman had one hand pressed flat to her own chest, like she was checking her heart was still going. "It's all right." Charlotte raised both hands, aiming for the look of someone who'd planned this. "Don't be afraid. I made these. They're tools." A cart?" the mother managed. "Yes, a cart. For the harvest, that's all." She turned to Alfred before anyone could ask a question she didn't have a calm answer for. "Show them." He walked to the nearest robot with the exaggerated sigh of a man performing a favor he fully intended to be thanked for later, and set a container down on its bed. The cart accepted it without incident, without speed, without so much as a rattle, sitting there as harmless as a wheelbarrow. Someone in the crowd exhaled. The boy stopped crying. The older woman lowered her hand from her chest, slowly, like she still wasn't fully convinced it was safe to. Charlotte filed away a private note that a cat-shaped chassis probably would have spared her this entire morning, and counted what she had left standing. Containers stacked, carts stopped, a crowd no longer actively fleeing toward the tree line. For now, she'd take it. The rest of the morning went to teaching 50 overeager machines some manners. She changed out of her nightclothes, marched the robots out to the fields herself at something closer to a crawl this time, and sent Alfred ahead to explain things to the women and children before the carts arrived, and did the explaining badly on their own a second time. Hitch's face, when 50 of them rolled into view behind her, went through several distinct stages of alarm before landing on polite terror. "Countess! That behind you, they're carts," she said. "Convenient ones. Gather your people." He did, fast, calling in every leader and assistant from the rows, his voice cracking only slightly on the word robots. Alfred, his part finished, peeled off toward the far end of the field where the rest of the household waited, looking entirely too pleased with himself for a man who'd spent the whole morning being run off his feet. Charlotte stood in front of the assembled workers, dirt-streaked, sun-tired, and visibly bracing for whatever came next, and gave them the closest thing to an apology she had. The robots had gotten loose once already that morning. That was on her, not on anything they'd done wrong. It wouldn't happen twice. Then she asked for volunteers, whoever could learn the system fastest and teach the rest. A handful stepped forward, more out of duty than confidence by the look of them. She had the robots commit each face to memory, a process that involved the machines slowly circling each volunteer in turn, lenses or whatever, passed for lenses fixed on them, which looked, to everyone watching, exactly like being hunted. Someone whimpered. Someone else clapped both hands over their mouth. One man went very still and very pale, like he was reconsidering every decision that had brought him to this field. "Stop that!" Charlotte said, more to the robots than the workers, and laid out the rules before anyone could actually faint. Slow down, keep to the left, never crowd a person, and if a child was anywhere close, practically crawl. No exceptions, she added, mostly for her own benefit. Remembering the goat. She picked one of the volunteers. Walk to the collection point. He went, glancing back twice like he expected to be chased. A robot fell in behind him instead, matching his pace exactly. Container riding steady on its bed, keeping a polite distance the whole way. By the time he reached the collection point and looked back, half the fear on his face had already curdled into something closer to wonder. Good, Charlotte was already turning back to the row. Now the rest of you learn to do that, and by tonight, I want every field running the same way. By late afternoon, the whole field ran on a system instead of a scramble. Charlotte tapped the black panel mounted on a cart's front, and it lit up with a simple menu. Touch here to set where it starts. She tapped again once the worker beside her had placed an eggplant into the container. Then this button sends it off. The cart rolled away on its own toward the collection point, unhurried now, well inside its speed limit. A worker jogged after it, swapped the full container for an empty one, and pressed the same button to send it home again. Down the row, another leader was already walking a second worker through the same steps without needing to be told twice. "It's magic," Charlotte told the row of watching faces, before anyone could ask how a box did any of that. "Don't worry about the rest." Nobody argued with magic. A few of them looked like they wanted to, and thought better of it. She turned to Hitch, who had spent the last hour quietly running the whole rotation himself without once looking to her for the next instruction. 50 carts. I'm leaving the day-to-day distribution to you. Who gets one? Who trains on it? All of it. Anything that breaks, take it to Alfred. I'm done walking these fields myself. Yes, Countess. Whatever alarm Hitch had walked in with that morning didn't survive the sentence. He said it like a man accepting a job he'd already half started doing on his own, not just an order handed down from above. Charlotte found Alfred on the ridge that evening, watching 50 small lights blink on across the fields below as the robots settled into their overnight charge, patient and orderly now. Nothing at all like the morning's runaway parade. "No kingdom on this continent has anything like that," he said, nodding at the lights. "You know that, I know." Below them, the harvest that morning had threatened to rot in the fields was already halfway to the storehouses, moving itself there while everyone else went home for dinner. No shortage, no crisis. Just a field finally running the way she'd meant it to from the start, quiet and steady under 50 small lights. It was doing in one evening what would have taken every free hand in the territory a week to manage by basket alone. "Worth the chickens?" Alfred asked. "Ask the chickens," Charlotte said, "and let the fields answer the rest." Alfred caught her before she'd finished her tea. "Countess, we have a problem." He said it the way he always did when the problem was actually good news dressed up as a crisis. The harvest came in at nearly triple what the storehouses were built to hold. Charlotte set the cup down. "That's not a problem. That's a party. It's a problem if word of it reaches the capital." He laid it out plainly. Root vegetables could be pickled and kept, but the summer crop was already turning in the crates, and there was more of it than the territory could eat, sell, or store before it spoiled. Quietly dumping the surplus was the safest option. Quietly selling it was the profitable one. Loudly doing either was how a father who'd forgotten she existed remembered again. "We sell a little," she said. "Not enough to explain where it came from, just enough to move it before it rots." Alfred didn't argue. He never did once she'd already decided, but he watched her face a beat too long, the way he did when he suspected there was a second decision hiding behind the first one. There was. "I'm going to the church," she said. "Tomorrow," he blinked. The church. The one from the ceremony. She was already turning it over in her head. The goddess owed her a conversation, one she'd been putting off for exactly as long as she'd been busy enough to justify putting it off. "I have questions. She's going to answer them this time." That much was true, and it was also not the whole truth. And Alfred, who had learned, across months of her sudden decisions, exactly which ones came with a second layer underneath, did not push. Not yet. Alone, she let herself actually think about it, and that turned out to be the mistake. It had been years. Her years, this body's years, whatever unit of time applied to a girl who died once already and was apparently still on the clock for a second time, since she'd let herself remember how the book ended, not the middle, not the ceremony, or the exile, or any of the 100 problems she'd solved since, the ending. The one she'd read in another body, in another life, with her sister leaning over her shoulder, asking why she kept rooting for the villain. Charlotte Fitzgerald burned. That was the plot. Cornered at the end of the story, she brought the whole thing down with her, herself included, in an explosion loud enough to close the book. 3 months of the best-run harvest on the continent, and not once in all that time had she asked the one person who might actually know whether that ending still applied to her. She didn't know if reincarnation had quietly rewritten it, or just paused it, or done nothing at all, and left a fuse burning somewhere she couldn't see. She had never asked. It hadn't felt urgent. Crisis after crisis had kept the question comfortably buried, and now the crises had stopped, and the question had nowhere left to hide. It didn't arrive like fear. That was the part that unsettled her most. It arrived like an unpaid bill she'd genuinely forgotten existed, small and administrative and cold all the way through. She did the math anyway, sitting there in the low lamplight. However many years since the tea party, however many since the exile, however many since she'd quietly stopped counting at all, because counting implied she expected the number to matter, and for 3 months she'd been too busy proving it didn't. She didn't land on a figure. She landed on the plain fact that she didn't have one, and somehow that was worse than any number could have been. The lamp guttered, low on oil, and steadied again. She sat with the thought a long moment, then blew it out anyway. There was, after all, a trip to prepare for. She'd fallen asleep at her desk, designing the trip's 2 other problems, and woken to find both of them finished. The little people had worked through the night without asking permission, the way they always did, and left the results parked outside, like gifts nobody had ordered, but everybody wanted. The bus was modified, lower and sleeker than before. Beside it sat something new, a scooter built to her exact size, bright and compact, with a basket on the front and a hidden compartment under the seat. Capable, she'd specified, of 100 kilometers an hour. She circled it twice before Alfred cleared his throat. "That," he said, "is not a horse. It's better than a horse." She made no attempt to hide how delighted she was, and reached for the handlebars before Mason, loading vegetables 2 steps away, cleared his throat in exactly the tone of a man who has learned to interrupt without being asked why. "Countess, the sun." Right. There was no time to ride it. Breakfast came fast. Vegetables went into the bus in an amount carefully calculated to look like a few days' surplus rather than a territory's worth. And by the time the sun cleared the wall, she was behind the wheel, with Alfred and Keith mounted behind her, and Mason riding inside. The Countess's sigil had come off her collar for the trip. Plain travel clothes, nothing that marked her as anyone worth stopping. She pulled away at a pace just brisk enough to leave the horses working to keep up, and didn't bother hiding how much she enjoyed that either. They reached the relay town in under an hour, which told her exactly how much time she'd been wasting on horses all this time. She pulled off the road before anyone in town could get a good look at the bus and ordered Alfred and Keith to hang back. "Transform," she called, and the bus folded itself down into something that looked, from 10 paces, like an ordinary horse-drawn cart. Wheels, boards, canvas. Nothing that belonged in this century instead of the last one. The horses did not agree that it looked ordinary. Both animals reared and scrambled backward, hard enough that it took Alfred and Keith several minutes of hard talking and harder pulling to settle them. Keith's horse settled last, and settled worse. By the time it was calm enough to hitch to the cart, its rider wore the look of a man asked to give up a limb for a good cause. "It's for the mission," she told him. Keith didn't answer so much as accept it, the way a man accepts weather. Mason took the driver's bench. Keith folded himself into the cart bed among the vegetables, and they rolled into town looking like exactly what they were pretending to be. Nobody worth a second look. Past the town, with no one close enough to see, she transformed the cart again, lower this time, faster, an open driver's seat and a wheel built for speed instead of disguise. Alfred did not look thrilled about it. "Enough," he said. "Your magic isn't ordinary anywhere outside our own walls. People remember things like this. Please don't give them a reason to." She agreed, mostly because he was right, and spent the rest of the day driving at a pace that wouldn't turn heads instead of one that would. A second town went by, smaller and shabbier than the first, people staring anyway at the knight's escort, even with the wagon behaving itself. 2 hours and one roadside lunch later, the city she remembered from her last birthday came into view, and she reverted the buggy to a plain carriage before anyone at the gate could ask questions she didn't want to answer. For the gate itself, she gave up the driver's seat entirely and rode double behind Alfred. Safer if anything went wrong there. Nothing went wrong. Alfred paid the entry tax, the same kind of tax she'd been meaning to set up at her own border for a year now, and they passed through into the city proper. Alfred sent Mason and Keith ahead with the cart to sell the vegetables, while he and Charlotte hung back, far enough not to look like a party traveling together. It didn't take long for a crowd to find the wagon anyway. People pressed in around Mason before he'd even stopped moving, asking how much he was carrying, whether he could spare anything at all. "Anything," one woman said, "not quite steady. 1 sack, even one." Mason, working the crowd like the merchant he used to be, learned more than he sold. The shelves here normally held 3 times what they were holding now, and people were already talking about winter, about whether the potatoes would last, about wheat that hadn't come in from anywhere on schedule. She filed that away without slowing down. Not her problem yet. Then a voice cut through the noise. "Mason, that's you! Mason!" A face from some earlier version of Mason's life, delighted and much too loud about it. His smile didn't slip, but it went very still for exactly 1 second before he recovered and steered the conversation somewhere safer. Alfred noticed. She noticed. Neither of them stopped walking, and neither mentioned it again. Not today, with the church still ahead of them, though she marked it down as a question that hadn't gone anywhere either. Alfred walked her as far as the gate and no further. "Milady, I'll take the horse. You wait here," she said, already moving, and he let her go the way he always eventually let her go, reluctantly, without actually stopping her. 2 gatekeepers looked her over the way adults look over a child who has wandered somewhere she doesn't belong. One of them told her, not unkindly, that she shouldn't be wandering off from her father. She answered by opening a coin bag heavy enough to make its own argument, mostly copper, with just enough silver writing visible at the top to catch the light. Neither man counted the rest of it. Neither man needed to. The gate opened. Inside, she walked past the goddess statues without a glance. She had opinions about at least one of them, and none of those opinions were things she planned to say out loud today, and headed straight for the side door she remembered. 3 priests blocked it before she got there. "I am Charlotte Fitzgerald," she said, holding out a donation before anyone could ask who let her in. "Of the House of Duke Fitzgerald." The name landed the way it always did lately. Recognition first, warmth nowhere. They took the money anyway. When she added that she'd woken that morning to a blinding light, clearly a revelation, and had come for the details, the priests traded a look that seemed to explain why so few visitors had come through that day, and stepped aside. Nobody had sent her a revelation. She'd made that part up on the spot, and she was through the door before anyone had time to think too hard about it. "Goddess!" She planted both feet and yelled it at the empty room like she'd been rehearsing the volume the whole ride over. "Get out here! I know you can hear me!" The mist answered slower than she liked, but faster than last time. A pale shape resolving out of nothing, already talking before it finished forming. I'm sorry, really sorry. I heard you, I promise. It's just, you've heard me plenty. That's not the problem." She crossed her arms. "How many people are you even listening to at once?" The shape wavered. "Tens of thousands. All at the same time. It's a lot of voices. And yours doesn't always? Fine. New system." She clapped her hands once, sharp. "That's me. When you hear that, it's me. And you answer. Or, I come back here every week until you do. Could you maybe show a little more reverence? I am a goddess. You're an intern who's never been fired," she said. "And I'm the one client you can't afford to lose." Next, she didn't let the shape recover before moving to the part she'd actually come for. The little people who built everything she asked for still couldn't speak to her, couldn't be touched, and vanished the moment she tried to hold a real conversation with whoever was in charge of them. She wanted that fixed, at minimum, their leader talking, and tangible, whenever there was something to actually discuss instead of guessed at. The goddess hedged, hesitated, offered something about how no deity had ever set up a line like that with a mortal before. It wasn't a no. Charlotte treated it like one anyway. "I didn't ask if it was normal," she said. "I asked if it was possible." I suppose it's possible, then it's happening. She let the silence sit there until it got uncomfortable, and it worked exactly as well as it had every other time she'd used it. Fine, the goddess said at last, smaller than before. Fine, it's done. And I want a way to call you, something faster than waiting for the mist to feel like showing up. A pause, then, weakly. Shout, goddess summon, that should reach me. Goddess summon! She tested the shape of the words, satisfied. Good, that's everything. She turned to go, already thinking about the ride home, about the scooter she still hadn't ridden, about whether Mason's face in that crowd meant anything worth worrying over later. Goodbye. She was already walking away before the word finished landing, and left the goddess standing alone in the mist, looking like she'd just survived something. Alfred was waiting exactly where she'd left him. Well, productive, she said, and meant it. Full communication with the little people, coming. A way to summon the goddess whenever she wanted, instead of whenever the goddess felt brave enough to show up. Every mechanical limit she'd been living with since that first ceremony, gone in one conversation, because it turned out all it took was refusing to leave the room. It was, by any honest measure, a very good day. She didn't say the other thing. Somewhere between the shouting and the clapping and the goddess folding under pressure the way she always did, she'd had every chance in the world to ask the only question that actually mattered. Whether the story still ended the way she remembered it, whether there was still a fuse somewhere with her name burned into it, running down toward a date she couldn't see, and she hadn't asked it, not once. There would be a next time, she told herself. She had a summoning word for it now, practically a standing appointment. It would keep. She just hadn't used it for the one thing she'd actually come here for. She noticed that, filed it away next to Mason's face in the crowd, and said nothing about either one as she climbed up behind Alfred for the ride home. Behind them, the church went dark, window by window. Ahead of them, the road home looked exactly like it had that morning, like nothing about the day had changed at all. Charlotte came out of the chapel with one God's promise finally pinned down, and found the street outside a wall of people. Alfred was waiting by the door, and for once, he didn't look amused. Keith and Mason are somewhere in that, he said, nodding at the crowd. Word is the vegetables were too cheap. That was all it took. A cart selling good food for nothing had pulled half the district into one street at once, and now nobody could move. Not the crowd, not the wagon, not Keith, who she could just make out near the back, hemmed in on all sides by people waving coin at him. Charlotte didn't argue with the problem, she just solved it. She climbed the chapel steps, raised both arms, and announced a divine sign from the gods in her best oracle voice. Then she lit the sky. The firework went up from the spire in a column of gold and cracked open over every upturned face in the square. While the whole crowd gasped at once, Alfred hauled her under one arm, not the carry she would have chosen, and shoved through the stunned onlookers to the wagon. Keith had gone pale. Mason looked like a man who'd survived something. Charlotte lit a second firework, bigger than the first, and the wagon rolled for the gates, while the city was still busy looking up. Clear of the gates, Charlotte folded the wagon's benches into a table and finally asked what had actually happened. Keith answered first, still nursing his dignity. The problem wasn't that they were bad, he said. They were good. Palace grade easily. Merchants had swarmed the cart demanding to know where produce like that came from, then turned ugly when no good answer came. Mason twisted his sleeve before he got the words out. I couldn't tell them the truth, so I told them nothing. That, he admitted, had made things worse, not better. He'd caught enough shouted over his head to piece together why. The wheat harvest had failed. Grain prices in the region were already climbing, and one trader had used the words worst in 10 years without anyone arguing. Mason had gone hungry once himself, in a bad year, in a county not unlike this one. He said it plainly, without asking for sympathy, and Charlotte filed it away next to everything else he'd never volunteered about his old life. It explained the twisting sleeve. A man who had watched a market run out of food before did not stand calmly in the middle of one doing it again. Gertz County, specifically? She asked. Mason nodded. His old trade permit still listed it. You're not talking about avoiding a market, Alfred said. You're talking about walking straight into one. Charlotte was already reaching for her coat. I'm talking about finding out how bad it actually is before I decide what to do about it. Nobody argued that plainly enough to stop her. By the time they were back on her own land, Charlotte had a plan, and the three of them had gone quiet in the way that meant they didn't like it. She had no writ that let her set foot in Gertz County. An exiled duke's daughter had no standing to cross that border for any reason, official or otherwise. That hadn't changed just because she was thriving. So the crossing would have to be one nobody could ever trace back to her. A tunnel, she said, straight from here to wherever Mason sets up shop. No gate, no guard, no record. Mason's permit was still valid. technically his own, never revoked. The cover story wrote itself: a traveling merchant impressed by a wall he'd heard about, buying up surplus at border prices and going looking for somewhere to sell it. Keith would guard him. Nobody needed to know who had actually grown the vegetables or dug the tunnel. Alfred said he had a bad feeling about this. Then he agreed anyway, the way he always did once he'd said so for the record. She was already moving toward the door. "Tomorrow, we prepare today." Nobody cheered. She decided not to notice. Building it took one conversation and most of the afternoon. Charlotte gave the little people the shape she wanted: a wide, gently sloped passage, wide enough for the bus, lit bright enough that nobody would ever need a torch, running clean under the border, and coming up close enough to Mason's future shop to matter. Lights that would hold 2 weeks without sun, in case anyone needed to use it in a hurry. They took the order and immediately picked it apart. Her measurements were vague, one of them told her, and her instructions worse. She snapped back that she was explaining it so they could actually build it right. And if something was unclear, they should say which part instead of complaining about all of it at once. It got done anyway. That was the maddening part. Somewhere between her irritation and theirs, the specifications landed. Bus width, torch bright, sealed against the weather and anyone walking overhead, and they went to work without another word. She left before dark, already annoyed at how little credit she was going to get for how well this was about to go. By morning, it was finished. The ground near the collection point had grown a strange colored seam overnight, and half the village had already worked itself into a quiet panic about it by the time Charlotte arrived to explain. She kept the explanation short: a passage, sealed, safe, hers. The panic didn't leave their faces entirely, but it stopped spreading, which was the best she could ask for this early. Getting into the tunnel was the easy part. Getting into Gertz County unrecognized was harder. Her hair marked her as clearly as a name tag. Every noble in the region knew that particular red, so she had the little people dye it a plain brown for as long as the trip required, and traded her sigil and her usual clothes for something a merchant's daughter might actually wear. Alfred did a poor job of hiding how strange it was to look at her and not recognize her at a glance. "Don't get used to it," she told him, and went down into the light. The gate guard didn't even read the papers. He waved them through without looking up, and that alone told Charlotte something about how little anyone here was watching for trouble anymore. Mason set up in a square at the end of a street that had clearly seen better trade. Charlotte kept to the back of the cart, playing merchant's daughter, and let the first hour tell her everything the reports hadn't. People came for vegetables the way people come for something they've been afraid they wouldn't get. An old man picked up a head of cabbage, turned it over twice, and told Charlotte it had been years since he'd seen quality like this. Not since before the last count's wife had died, he said. Back when the roads were kept up properly too. Then he asked, kindly enough, if she was out here helping her father instead of being in school. Something old and reflexive rose in her at being spoken to like a child playing shopkeeper. She swallowed it. A duke's daughter would have corrected him. A merchant's daughter said thank you and moved the next basket forward. He meant the compliment about the cabbage kindly. It landed like a diagnosis anyway. Word moved through the square faster than Mason could restock. Within an hour, they'd capped it at 1 per customer, and it still wasn't enough. People who'd already bought came back and tried again under a different face, and Mason had to turn away neighbors he clearly recognized. Within 2, the cart was empty, and he was apologizing to a line of people who wouldn't leave. This wasn't the shortage the Count's office described in whatever reports reached the capital. This was a county that had been quietly starving for longer than anyone official wanted to admit. Charlotte had barely let that settle when it got worse. A cluster of armed men shoved through the crowd, county colors on their coats, and demanded the last of the stock be handed over outright. County business, no argument needed, and a license, they made clear, could vanish as easily as it had been granted. Keith didn't wait to see how that ended. He had Mason moving before the men reached the cart, cutting a path back through bodies still too startled to grab at them. The scuffle that broke out behind them was loud enough to cover the retreat and small enough to call it mercy. They didn't stop moving until the noise dropped away and the tunnel entrance was in sight. Mason's hands didn't stop shaking until they were underground. Charlotte didn't blame him. She had come to confirm a rumor. She was leaving with a fact instead. Gertz County's famine wasn't the kind that fixed itself, and the man ruling it was either unable to say so or unwilling to. The stock she'd have sold the next day went somewhere else instead. Past midnight, with the town asleep and the church's back gate the only door she trusted, Charlotte had the little people stack crate after crate of vegetables against the wall where the orphanage caretakers would find them at first light. No name, no signature, just a note asking that the children be fed first. Keith called it reckless before he called it decent. Mason didn't say anything at all. He just kept lifting crates faster than he needed to, like the work itself was the only way he could stand to be there. Nobody outside the three of them would ever know who had left the food. That, Charlotte decided, was exactly how she wanted it. They were back underground before the first bell rang. 10 days after the food appeared at the church, a familiar face showed up at Charlotte's own gate, asking for her by name. Dorn hadn't bothered pretending to be a merchant this time. He introduced himself as an envoy of Count Gertz and requested an audience with Lady Charlotte Fitzgerald, polite and unhurried, the way a man asks for something he already expects to be given. Charlotte watched from the mansion steps with Alfred beside her, close enough to see and far enough not to be seen, and let Keith handle it exactly as instructed. The lady is unwell, Keith told him. A bad cold. No visitors for now. He offered to take a letter instead and mentioned that 10 days from now, with proper notice, might go better. Dorn accepted the refusal with the same smooth courtesy he'd arrived with. It should have ended there. On his way out, almost an afterthought, he asked about the small red mechanism mounted near the gate. Wondered aloud what it was for, whether it rang somewhere, who heard it. Keith gave him nothing. It didn't matter. Dorn had already seen enough without an answer. A gate better guarded than the size of the territory explained, a lord too conveniently sick to meet him, and a county full of rumors about a wall too solid for the money behind it. He bowed, wished the lady a swift recovery, and rode off unhurried, a man who already had what he came for. Charlotte watched the dust from Dorn's horse settle on the road long after he was out of sight. "He got something," she said. "I don't know what yet, but he got something." Alfred didn't argue with her. He rarely did when she used that particular flat voice. Whatever Dorn carried back to Count Gertz would land on a desk belonging to a man who was hungrier, angrier, and more desperate than his letters to the capital ever let on. That was not a problem she had any way to reach from here. She stayed on the balcony until the road was empty and the light went out of it, and told herself, without quite believing it, that 10 days was a long time. The letter reached her a week after she sent Dorn back down the road with nothing but a message and a countdown. It came sealed with her father's crest, which told her most of what she needed to know before she'd even broken the wax. Duke Fitzgerald wanted grain, a great deal of it, and quickly, and he wanted an explanation for why she hadn't bothered reporting her own harvest numbers to a man who no longer had any legal claim to see them. He mentioned, in the tone of someone who had never once been told no and did not expect to start now, that he would come collect it personally if she made him wait. She read it twice at the breakfast table, then set it down beside her tea with the care of someone setting down something that had already stopped mattering to her. He didn't write this alone. She set it down again, this time for good. Alfred, standing behind her chair with Keith a step further back, didn't need to ask what she meant. Dorn had left 10 days ago with a look at her gate and a head full of numbers he hadn't earned honestly. 10 days was exactly enough time for that information to reach a man who was still hungry, still furious at being turned away twice, and apparently still on speaking terms with her father. Count Gertz hadn't asked her for anything this time. He'd gone around her and asked the one man in the kingdom who could ask with an army behind him. A polite letter back, Alfred said. A gift, maybe. Something that costs you a little and this a lot less. He's not asking. Her voice stayed flat. He's informing me. There's a difference. And it isn't one you fix with a fruit basket. Alfred had made this argument before and lost it before, and from the set of his jaw, he already knew how this round would go too. He tried anyway. The risk to her standing, the danger of open defiance against a sitting duke, the cost of anything that looked like an attack on his knights. She heard the whole thing out and told him, not unkindly, that she'd already decided to prepare for a fight regardless. She could have answered 500 knights with something considerably less forgiving than what she had in mind. She'd built worse before without meaning to. This time, she meant to build something that stopped a war without starting one back. Loud, humiliating, and completely survivable for everyone on both sides of it. Whether that counted as mercy or as a mistake she'd regret later, she genuinely didn't know yet. She intended to find out the hard way, which was the only way she ever found anything out. She sketched the shape of it out loud, since Alfred was going to worry regardless, and worrying productively was at least useful. 3 tiers, she told him. The first only needed to be loud, something that announced itself far enough out that anyone with sense turned around before they got close enough to matter. The second needed to blind and disorient anyone who ignored the first warning, hard enough to break a formation without breaking a person inside it. The third, for whoever was too stubborn or too well armored to take either hint, needed to drop them where they stood and keep them there until somebody came to collect them. Alfred asked carefully, what happened to anyone who made it past all three? Nobody makes it past all three, she said. That's the point of building three. Halt the new fields, she told Keith. Everything goes into the wall for now. 5 days bought a great deal when the little people were the ones building it. By the time the alarm rang, the wall carried 5 times the defenses it had held a season ago. All of it disguised as something a child would want stuffed into her bed rather than mistaken for what it actually was. Alfred had stopped asking where the little people came from months ago. He hadn't stopped being unsettled by them. The alarm itself was not subtle. It was built to tell an armed column from a farmer with a hoe, and it only had one setting once it decided which one it was looking at. From the wall, the whole arrangement looked almost peaceful. Rows of black bears standing shoulder to shoulder in the grass. White and black rabbits scattered between them, like something a child had left out overnight. A scatter of cats near the gate itself. Nothing about any of it looked like a weapon until it was already too late to matter. It went off a little after midday, and by the time Charlotte and Alfred reached the wall with a spare set of binoculars between them, the formation was already visible on the road below. Knights in her father's colors, riding in the kind of order that assumed nobody on this side of the wall was going to be a problem. That's the Duke's own household guard. Alfred didn't lower the binoculars. Not hired men, not a message. That's an answer. Good, Charlotte said. I already built one back. 3 riders went ahead of the main formation, the way scouts always did, and they were the first to learn that the field wasn't empty ground. It was rows of black bear statues, 2 meters tall, planted close enough together that nothing on horseback could pass between them without brushing one. The first horse to try it set off a sound built to carry half a mile, and impossible to enjoy from any closer than that. It wasn't a roar, it was worse. A shrieking, grinding alarm pitched exactly wrong for anything with animal ears, and every horse within range reacted like the ground itself had turned on them. Riders went down inside the first few seconds. Not thrown far, not thrown hard, just thrown the way any rider is thrown by a horse that decides correctly that it would rather be anywhere else. The formation that had looked so orderly from the wall came apart into loose horses and knights climbing to their feet against an alarm that did not stop for them. A few tried a blade on the nearest statue. It did nothing. A few more tried fire, then wind, then whatever else their training said worked against enchanted stone, and the bear did not so much as chip. Whatever the statues were made of, it wasn't the kind of stone anyone here had trained against. Charlotte watched all of it through her own field glasses, and if there was a version of this where she felt guilty, she hadn't found it yet. The alarm was doing exactly the job she'd built it to do, announcing itself, scaring the reasonable ones back, and leaving only the ones too stubborn to take a warning. The ones who kept moving forward, and enough of them did, because knights that proud rarely retreat from the first bad surprise, walked straight into the second field. White shapes, rabbit-sized and rabbit-shaped, lit up the instant anyone came within a few strides and put a wall of blinding light into their faces. Knights went down clutching their own eyes, night blind in broad daylight, crawling, because crawling was the only direction that still made sense to them. Some tried to shield their faces with a raised arm and kept walking anyway, guided by nothing but the sound of the man beside them going down. Behind the white rabbits came black ones, faster, and they didn't blind. They hit, low and hard enough to put an armored man on his back and keep him there. By the time the survivors staggered into range of the wall itself, there weren't many of them left standing, and none of the ones who were had anything left to fight with. One knight made it all the way to the gate. He was either the bravest of them or the last one who hadn't gotten the message, and it didn't matter which, because the cat statues waiting there did to him exactly what they'd been built to do. A jolt that dropped him where he stood, conscious, furious, and entirely unable to do anything about either. That was the end of it. The knight commander, who had spent the last several minutes watching his own formation dissolve into downed horses and blinded men without a single sword drawn against him, gave the order Charlotte had been waiting to hear since the alarm first rang. "Fall back," he shouted, and did not have to shout it twice. They gathered their own off the ground where they could, left the ones who couldn't be moved quickly for a second pass, and rode, or in a few cases limped, back down the road they'd come up so confidently that morning. The dust of it hung over the field long after the last horse cleared the tree line, settling slowly over statues that hadn't moved an inch and didn't look like they ever intended to. Nobody had died. Nobody on Charlotte's side had so much as raised a hand. Whatever ranking the capital's mage assessors had once given her, hedged and provisional, and filed under insufficient information, the field in front of her wall had just settled the argument without her needing to say a single word in her own defense. They still don't know what hit them. Alfred lowered his binoculars. They know exactly what hit them, she said. They just don't have a name for it yet. Alfred didn't celebrate. She hadn't expected him to. That was the first wave, he said. Your father doesn't lose gracefully, and neither does his pride. There will be a second one, and a third, and none of them will announce themselves as politely as this one did. He wasn't wrong, and she didn't tell him otherwise. She also didn't regret a single doll on that field. Killing a few hundred knights today would have bought her a war she couldn't win, and a name she'd never outrun, and it would have felt, if she was honest, like exactly the kind of thing the old Charlotte would have done without blinking. The kind of solution that solved the immediate problem and created 3 worse ones behind it. Restraint wasn't weakness here. It was the only version of this fight she'd been willing to have, and the only one that let her sleep through the night afterward without doing math on how many mothers she'd made into widows over a grain shipment. I'd rather deal with the second wave, she said, than deal with what I'd have to live with if I hadn't built it this way. Whether that was wisdom or just a debt coming due later, she genuinely couldn't say yet. She filed the question next to several others she hadn't answered and went to see how many more binoculars Keith actually needed. The Night Corps came home looking like they'd lost a war rather than failed to start one. More than half of them needed help climbing down off their horses. The butler took one look from the mansion steps and went to find the Duke before anyone had to ask him to. Duke Fitzgerald's first assumption, when told the Corps had returned early and in poor shape, was that his daughter had thrown one of her tantrums and someone had earned a bruise for it. He waved off the suggestion that he see the commander at once, dictated 2 unrelated letters about a shipping dispute, and finished his lunch before agreeing to anything. He agreed, eventually, to hear the report that afternoon, mostly to stop the butler standing in his doorway with that particular expression, the one that meant the household already knew something he didn't. The commander arrived still in half his armor, one arm bound up in a sling improvised from a torn cloak. Road dust ground into everything he wore. He had ridden ahead of the slower wounded rather than wait for a full accounting, because the Duke's temper only worsened with delay, and delay was the one thing left he could still control. He knelt to give his report. He did not enjoy kneeling, and enjoyed even less the part where he had to explain, in order, that they had never actually reached the village, that a wall and a field of enchanted statues had turned back the entire Corps without a single blade crossing anyone's, and that every knight who'd ridden out that morning had come home, either thrown, blinded, or dropped where he stood, and none of them dead, which was somehow the detail that unsettled the Duke most of all. "We could not enter the village, my lord," was as far as he got before the Duke cut him off, certain he'd misheard. His first question wasn't about the wall at all. He wanted to know whether Count Gertz's man had fed them false information on purpose, some petty sabotage dressed up as an alliance. The commander had to tell him, again, that the problem wasn't bad information. The problem was that the girl the Duke still pictured as a spoiled child throwing tantrums in a frontier ditch had built something nobody in his service had a name for. He made the commander say the whole of it again, slower, as though a second telling might rearrange the facts into something he could live with. It didn't. An entire household guard, sent to collect a debt from an 8-year-old girl living at the edge of nowhere, had been stopped cold by defenses that outclassed anything the Duke's own military instructors had ever described to him. Not beaten back with losses he could quietly bury either. Stopped without a single death, which meant there was no funeral to explain away, and no honest defeat to dress up as a fair fight gone wrong. Only a complete, humiliating, undeniable failure that every knight who rode home could describe to anyone who asked. Duke Fitzgerald had the same red hair he'd passed down to the daughter he hadn't seen in months, though nothing else about him that afternoon looked like a man in control of anything. And people would ask. Count Gertz, who had pushed him into this in the first place, still had a county quietly starving under a truth he'd spent months hiding from the crown, and the Duke understood, a beat too late, exactly how useful his own failure was about to become to a man who needed somewhere else to point when that truth finally surfaced. The capital was already gossiping about a daughter he'd exiled months ago and apparently underestimated twice, once at a tea party, and now here, in a report he couldn't unhear. every direction he looked, someone already held a piece of a story that made him look worse than the last person to tell it. For one unguarded moment, sitting in a chair he'd occupied like a throne for 30 years, Duke Fitzgerald understood that he had already lost. Not the skirmish itself, which barely mattered, but the larger, quieter fight over what people would say about him once this reached the king. The office around him, the desk he'd built his authority behind, suddenly felt like exactly what it was. 4 walls and some very good furniture, none of which could have stopped a single one of the statues his knights had just failed to so much as scratch. There was no order tonight that put a single knight back on his horse unbeaten, and no version of the truth he could hand the throne that made him look like anything but a man who had sent his household guard against his own child and lost. He did not choose what came next because he'd forgiven her, or feared for her, or felt anything resembling a father's regret. He chose it because it was the only move left on the board that protected him. He gave the order flatly. She was to be struck from the family register, effective immediately, recorded before word of any of this reached anyone above him. It wasn't justice. It wasn't even punishment. Not really. It cost her nothing she still wanted from him. It was a man cutting the one thread that could tie her failures, and now her strength, back to his own name, before Count Gertz or the capital or the king himself could ask why a disowned commoner's daughter had just handed his private guard the worst defeat in the family's history. He was not falling on his own sword. He was making sure no one could say it had ever been his sword to begin with. One more instruction followed, aimed squarely at the commander. Nothing further about the statues, nothing about the wall, and nothing resembling the truth would leave this room. As far as anyone above him needed to know, the matter had simply been allowed to drop. The commander said nothing to that, which the Duke chose to take as agreement. None of it reached Charlotte that evening. 2 counties away, in an office she'd never seen, her father was already cutting her out of a family she'd stopped wanting back sometime after the first slap. And she had no idea, and wouldn't for a while yet. She stayed on the wall until the dust from the retreat had settled completely, and the road below was empty again. Whatever came next, a second wave, a third, some quieter trouble she hadn't thought to build a doll for yet, it wasn't tonight's problem. Tonight's problem had already ridden home defeated, and whatever her father decided to do about that defeat, he was going to have to do it without knowing anything at all about what he'd actually be attacking next time. Feel better? Alfred asked. Not even a little, she said. I think I want to build something bigger. He didn't ask what. He'd learned better than that. Below them, the statues stood exactly where they'd stood that morning, patient and undamaged, already doing the only job she'd ever asked of them, waiting for someone else to make the next mistake. Charlotte counted the gap in her own wall for the 3rd time, and the number still refused to change. 6 knights had made it past the outer field before the cat statues finally dropped them. 6 was 5 more than she wanted, and 1 more than she could explain away as luck. Arms crossed in the doorway, Alfred watched her mark it down. You won, he said. That's usually the part where people stop frowning. She pushed the tally sheet across the desk instead of answering him directly. I won by a smaller margin than I like. They got through the bear alarm. They got through both rabbit lines. If there'd been 30 of them instead of a dozen, I'm not sure the cats would have held. So build a bigger cat. I was thinking, she said, already reaching for a blank sheet. Bigger than a cat. The shape came fast once she let herself draw it. The same triangular hat and pointed wooden shoes as her little people, scaled up until it could have looked the manor roof in the eye. How big? Alfred asked. 4 meters, to start. Alfred paused before he got to the real objection, the way he always did when he wanted her to hear the whole sentence before she argued with it. You are not building a 4-meter anything near the house. It's not near the house. It's outside the wall. She was already standing, sketch rolled under one arm. You do this every time. Win. Then spend the next morning already planning for the day you don't. I'm being thorough, she said, already heading for the door. And before you ask, yes, I know what happens if this doesn't scare him off. He stops sending knights and sends the regular army instead. That's a worse fight, not a smaller one. She didn't say the rest out loud, that a worse fight might be the one where restraint stopped being a choice she got to keep making. She wasn't ready to answer that question. She just intended to make sure she never had to answer it from a losing position, which was why the hands she was sketching onto this thing were built for shoving, not for anything sharper, not yet. Cheerful, she was already at the door. Come watch. I want a second opinion before the whole village sees it. The little people worked fast once she gave them a clear picture to build toward. Charlotte closed her eyes, held the shape steady in her head, and let the same trick that had raised her wall and her bear statues do the rest. It came up out of the dirt in under a minute. Titanium plating, same as the wall. Pastel-colored clothes cut from the same cheerful pattern as her little people's uniforms, sized up until each stitch was as long as her forearm. A painted, permanently fixed smile, wide enough to see from the road, its shadow swallowing half the cleared field before the dust even settled. Keith, walking a supply cart along the field path, dropped the reins. "That," he said, backing straight into the cart. "That is not—" He didn't finish the sentence. He screamed instead, short and ragged, and went very still, staring up at the smiling giant as if it might notice him if he moved. The villagers working the near fields did the same. A woman with a hoe froze mid-swing. Two boys dropped a bucket of feed and ran. An old man sat down hard in the dirt without appearing to decide to. "It isn't attacking anyone," Charlotte called out, hands on her hips, faintly pleased despite the chaos she'd caused. "It's just standing there being enormous." Nobody looked reassured. She studied the smile a moment longer. She'd fixed it on purpose. A blank-faced golem was only a wall that walked. A golem that grinned no matter what it did was the kind of thing that stayed in a knight's memory long after he'd retreated. Unsettling was the whole point of the face. "Giant number 1, she called up to it, mostly to prove she could. "Gently close that gate." It turned, wooden feet thudding twice into the dirt, and swung the outer gate shut with a care that looked almost delicate on something that size. Somewhere behind her, a villager made a small, strangled sound that wasn't quite a laugh. By the time Alfred found her again, the field had mostly emptied. "I told the village something new was coming," he said, dropping onto the low courtyard wall beside her. "I did not tell them it would be that tall. Expect fainting, possibly a lot of it. Then we don't show them the 4-meter one again." She'd already decided this on the walk back. "We build smaller first, 2 meters, then 3. Let them get used to the idea before the whole thing arrives at once." "And the smiling stays?" "It's not for the villagers," she said, turning the tally sheet over in her hands. "It's for whoever tests the wall next. We call it a festival, sacred giants, blessing the harvest, whatever story sells. Nobody outside this territory needs to know the gate just grew teeth." Alfred didn't argue with the shape of the plan. He never did, once she'd already built half of it. But he didn't let the harder question go either. "You still haven't answered what happens if the teeth aren't enough, if someone gets past all of it." She didn't answer right away. It was the same question she'd been circling since the knights broke against her defenses, and she'd felt nothing but relief, not guilt, that no one on either side of that wall had to die for her to win. She didn't know yet whether she'd feel the same way the day that stopped being true. "Then I deal with it when it's actually in front of me," she said. "Not before." Alone again, she went back to the sketches. Smaller frames this time, 2 meters and 3 meters. The same fixed smile scaled down until it looked almost friendly. Working through the measurements, a different plan crossed her mind entirely. Forget the golems. Forget the festival. Forget waiting to see what her father tried next. She could simply take him, walk into the capital herself, place a few of her little people where his guards couldn't see them, and end the guessing by making him answer her directly. She turned it over exactly once before she set it down. It would probably work. It would also hand him, or whoever inherited his mess once she'd embarrassed him in his own hallway, every excuse he needed to call her the aggressor, after she'd spent this long building the case that she wasn't. Whatever came next, it would have to arrive at her gate, not the other way around. She picked the pencil back up and kept drawing. Whatever her father decided to do next, he'd have to be the one to knock. Somewhere beyond the wall, a 4-meter giant stood in the dark with its wooden feet planted and its smile fixed in place, waiting, exactly as she'd built it to, for someone else to make the next mistake. The rider came alone, and that told Charlotte something had changed before he said a single word. Keith spotted him first from the gate tower and called it down before the man had even cleared the tree line. One horse, no armor, a plain seal she didn't recognize from that distance. No column behind him, for as far as the tower's eyes could see. Weeks earlier, the Duke's household guard had come up that same road in tight, confident formation, riders enough to fill the whole field before the wall finished counting them. This was one man, riding slowly enough not to spook the giant standing sentry over the near field. Keith rode out to check the tree line twice, before he was satisfied there was nothing hiding behind the herald worth worrying about. There wasn't. He didn't lower his own guard until the man had ridden well clear of the gate again, and said nothing about it afterward, which was, for Keith, its own kind of statement. Alfred met the man at the gate himself, and came back with the message before the herald had finished turning his horse around. "He's requesting a private audience," Alfred said. On the Duke's behalf. No soldiers. No demands. Just a conversation. On whatever terms you want to set. He watched her face more than he watched the heralds retreating back. He's asking to come alone, Countess. That alone tells you how bad it's gotten for him. And if it's a trap, he added, because it was his job to ask, then it's a very badly staffed one. Charlotte was already turning the idea over, not the question. One unarmed man doesn't threaten a wall like this. If he wanted a fight, he'd have sent knights again, and he already knows how that ended. It matched everything that had already been drifting into the territory for 3 weeks, carried in faster by Mason's old trade contacts than any official messenger could have managed. Count Gertz was telling anyone who'd listen that the whole campaign had been the Duke's idea and the Duke's failure, and that he himself had only watched a neighbor make a mistake he'd warned against. Capital nobles were repeating with real relish the story of a duke who'd exiled a daughter capable of drawing Princess Flap's own personal concern to her front door, and then sent his household guard to lose to that same daughter a second time. The king, according to the last report Mason had passed up the chain, had started asking exactly what kind of wall had done what an entire household guard apparently couldn't explain honestly. None of it had stayed contained the way the Duke ordered on the day his knight commander first reported the disaster. The knights themselves had talked, in barracks and taverns and anywhere else within earshot of the capital, about statues that wouldn't die and a girl who'd beaten an entire household guard without a single one of her own people lifting a hand. An order only held as far as the last man willing to keep his mouth shut, and that number, it turned out, had been 0. He can't explain any of it without explaining me, Charlotte said, turning the herald's message over once, out loud. And he can't explain me without admitting what happened to his own guard. She could refuse the audience outright. A closed gate would say almost as much as an open one, and it would cost her nothing at all to send him home without a word. She decided against it before Alfred had time to argue for either answer. If her father wanted to come see exactly what he'd thrown away, she wasn't going to make him work to find it. She was going to make sure he saw every piece of it, in the order she chose, from the one angle that would cost him the most to look at directly. She walked the south field herself that same afternoon to check it, the way she'd once have walked a job site before signing off on it. The wall ran tallest there. The giant stood closest there. The town was visible from there without anyone needing to point it out. It was also the same ground where his knights had broken 3 weeks earlier. If he wanted to remember what waited for anyone who came onto it uninvited, she intended to make sure he stood on the exact spot to do it. 3 days, she told Alfred, once she'd seen enough. Tell him to come to the south field, and tell him he walks the last stretch on foot. No carriage all the way up to my gate. Not this time. Alfred didn't ask why. He'd stopped needing to a long time ago. 3 days later, Duke Fitzgerald came up the same road the knights had broken on, and nothing about the approach announced itself as a threat. 6 men rode with him, unarmed, in plain traveling colors instead of house crests. No banner, no formation worth the name. He had left his own household guard behind entirely this time, which told Charlotte, before he'd said a single word, exactly how much the last attempt had cost him. The wall stood at his back for the whole approach, titanium plating catching the midday sun hard enough to hurt to look at directly. The giant held its post a short walk further on, arms crossed, its fixed smile aimed at nothing in particular, and somehow finding him anyway. Beyond all of it, close enough to see clearly and too far to mistake for staging, the resettled town went on with its own ordinary business. Carts moving between the new brick houses, 2 boys chasing something across a market row that hadn't existed the year he signed the papers, exiling her to die on this exact ground. She hadn't arranged any of that for his benefit. She hadn't needed to. It was simply what the place looked like now, on an ordinary afternoon, and letting him see an ordinary afternoon cost her nothing and told him more than anything she could have staged on purpose. He dismounted at the edge of the field and walked the rest alone, on foot, exactly as she'd told the herald to tell him. Up close, he looked smaller than the man who'd struck her across a garden full of witnesses. The coat was the same cut he always wore, but he wore it now, like a man carrying it, rather than filling it out. There was more gray at his temples than she remembered, and a stillness in his hands that hadn't been there before. The look of a man who'd spent 3 weeks in rooms where every ally quietly measured how far to step back from him. She'd expected, on the ride out to this field that morning, that seeing him again might do something to her, old anger surfacing, some echo of the girl who'd once knelt in a garden with her cheek already swelling. It didn't happen. She watched him cross the last stretch of open ground and found, mostly, that she was simply waiting for him to get to the point. He stopped an arm's length further back than politeness required, looked past her once, slowly, at the wall, the giant, and the town, and only then found the sentence. "I did not expect this." Most people don't. Charlotte let the silence afterward sit exactly as long as she wanted it to. Alfred stood at her shoulder, arms crossed, saying nothing. Keith held the perimeter a short distance off, close enough to matter, and far enough to make clear this wasn't a conversation he intended to interrupt. Her father didn't open with an apology. She hadn't expected one. He opened instead with the thing that had actually brought him here. "Count Goetz has told the capital the campaign was mine alone," he said, "and the king has started asking questions I cannot answer without explaining what you are. My allies are already deciding how far from me to stand." He delivered it flatly, the way he'd once have reported a bad harvest to a steward. Only at the end did something in his voice slip. "I misjudged what you were." It cost him visibly to say even that much. He didn't go further. No apology followed it, no regret for the 8-year-old girl he'd struck and signed away in the same afternoon. Just the flat admission of a man correcting a miscalculation, nothing more. Beside her, Alfred's jaw tightened at that, just slightly, and he said nothing, which was exactly what she needed from him. His eyes went once to the town behind her, lingering there longer than anywhere else. "Those are Goetz's people," he said. It wasn't quite a question. They were. She didn't elaborate further, and didn't need to. He'd already done the math himself, the same way Count Goetz eventually would if he hadn't already. A starving county's own subjects, walking away toward the lord who fed them, while their own count went on blaming someone else for the hunger driving them off. It wasn't her doing that his allies' failures had become her recruiting ground. She'd simply been the only one standing there with food when they finally decided to leave. He looked away from the town and back at her, and for just a moment, something crossed his face that might, in a kinder story, have been shame. It didn't stay long enough for her to be sure, and she didn't ask him to explain it either way. Charlotte let herself actually weigh her options before answering, because she'd promised herself on the ride out that she would, rather than simply reaching for whichever one felt best in the moment. She could make him wait. She could describe in exact detail every knight who'd gone down blind and screaming across this same field 3 weeks earlier, and watch what that did to his face. She could ask him to say the word sorry outright and find out whether he even had it in him to finish the sentence. She could have listed it all for him instead. The wall, the giant, the 32 refugees he'd never have bothered to count, a harvest that fed more people most winters than his own territory did, made him say out loud that his exiled, worthless daughter had built more in months than he had in a lifetime. She turned each option over once and set it down again, unused. All three would have felt good for about as long as it took to say. None of them would have gotten her the one thing she actually wanted, or cost him anything he hadn't already lost on his own. Some old, buried part of her, the part that had apparently been waiting all this time for a version of this exact moment where he said something warmer, noted its own disappointment quietly, and then, for the first time, let it go without a fight. "You're not here to apologize." She let that land before she went on. "You're here because you have no one left to blame but me, and even that isn't working." He didn't argue the point. That, more than anything he'd said out loud, told her she'd read the visit correctly. "I am prepared to correct the registry error," he said, "and end this dispute in exchange for your silence on the particulars of the campaign, and no further hostility from either side." The registry error, not the disownment, not the months she'd spent building a nation out of what he'd meant as a death sentence. A clerical mistake, filed once and now to be unfiled. Exactly the kind of language a man reached for when he needed a transaction and couldn't survive calling it anything else out loud. She almost laughed at the size of what he was offering set against the size of what he'd taken. Then she did the arithmetic anyway, because the arithmetic was the only part of this that actually mattered to her. A formal reversal put her back on Fitzgerald paper as his daughter, in ink the crown itself would recognize, with no further claim from him on her territory, her people, or her time ever again. It also meant that any noble house tempted to test her borders, the way Count Goetz once had, would now have to reckon with a name the crown recognized as legitimate, not an orphaned nobody with nothing to invoke. It cost her nothing she still wanted. It closed permanently, the one thread that let anyone above her still treat her as unfinished family business rather than a settled matter. Charlotte didn't blink. "I'll take the paperwork. I don't need the sentiment." He started on something else, the shape of an apology, maybe, or an excuse dressed up as one, and stopped himself halfway through the first word. Whatever it was going to be, he chose not to finish it. He straightened instead, the posture of a man closing a business meeting rather than a wound, and produced the registry correction from inside his coat, already drafted, already sealed with the ducal signet, needing only her mark beside his to be binding. Alfred read the wording over her shoulder before she signed, checking it twice himself, and only nodded once he was satisfied there was no trap folded into the clauses. She signed against his offered ledger book rather than anything of her father's. Only once the ink was down did the Duke ask, stiffly, what she intended to tell people about today's meeting. "Tell the king whatever protects you," she said, holding his eyes the whole time she said it. "I stopped needing your permission a long time ago." He had no answer for that. Behind him, his 6 unarmed men had gone very still, watching a scene none of them fully understood. A duke bowing, however slightly, to the exiled daughter they'd all been told meant nothing. He gave her the smallest bow the occasion technically required, turned, and walked back toward them, past the wall, past the giant, past the town he had once been so certain would kill her quietly enough that nobody would ever have to ask him about it again. Charlotte watched the 6 of them ride back down the road until the dust settled, this time on her own terms instead of his. Nobody had shouted. Nobody had needed to. Months earlier, a carriage had carried her out of the capital and away from this man. Today, it was his own party riding away from her, smaller than the one that had escorted her out, and she found she felt nothing sharper about it than a kind of tired, professional satisfaction. She didn't move until the last of them had gone, the same way she'd once stayed on this wall watching an army retreat instead of a request. This time, nobody needed picking up off the ground on either side, and nothing about the road behind them looked like a battle at all. Keith let out a breath he'd apparently been holding since the herald first arrived 3 days earlier, and didn't try to hide it. Alfred came to stand beside her once the last horse cleared the tree line, and stayed quiet long enough that she assumed he had nothing to say. He proved her wrong. "For what it's worth," he said, "I don't think anyone could have called this the day we left the capital." She didn't answer right away. Months earlier, a knight barely out of his own boyhood had volunteered to follow a disgraced 8-year-old into a wasteland for reasons he'd waved off at the time as a whim, and had never fully explained since, not once, across everything that came after. "Was it?" she asked. "A whim?" No, he said it plainly, without the deflection he usually hid behind when a question got too close to the real answer. It stopped being one a long time before today. She let that sit exactly as long as it deserved, watching the empty road, and decided it was as close to a straight answer as he was ever going to give her, and closer than she'd honestly expected to get. That night, alone in the study with the lamp lit low, Charlotte let herself think about the one thing the day's business hadn't touched. Months ago, in a cold office with no fire lit, she'd negotiated her own survival out of a man who never once looked like he wanted to give her anything. A single year's funding stretched into 7, a handful of servants he'd expected her to fail to find, a 2-week deadline she'd turned into the rest of her life. Today, she had sat across the same kind of table from the same man, and this time, he was the one asking for terms. She let herself hold that shape for a moment before she moved on to the part that still had teeth. Other pieces of these last several months came back with it, uninvited but not unwelcome. 2 terrified maids offering to follow her into exile because they had nowhere else to go and nothing left to lose either way. 32 barefoot refugees walking the last mile into a territory that had been nothing but ruined ground when she arrived. A wall standing exactly where she'd told it to stand, holding exactly as long as she'd needed it to. None of it had ever asked anyone's permission first. That, more than the paper Alfred now had folded into his coat, was what she actually walked away from today with. She still had the words to summon the goddess whenever she wanted, a standing arrangement, no waiting required. She'd had them for months, and had never once used them for the actual question she'd ridden to that church to ask, whether Charlotte Fitzgerald's ending, the explosion, the scream, the villainess burning the whole story down around herself on the last page, was still coming, or delayed, or gone for good. She thought about summoning the goddess right then and finally asking. She turned the pen over in her hand, decided against it, and set the pen down instead. It wasn't fear that stopped her. That was the part that actually surprised her, sitting with it in the quiet. Months ago, the question would have kept her awake, shaking, going over the same numbers with no answer at the end of them. Tonight, it sat next to the ledger and the signed registry papers, like one more piece of unfinished business among several. No longer the one item on the list with the power to undo everything else she'd built if it ever came due. Whatever the answer turned out to be, she would face it from a field with a wall on it, a giant standing post, and a town full of people who had chosen to stay because of what she'd built, not because of what she'd been born to. Not from a garden with her father's handprint still stinging on her cheek, and not from a cold office with a 2-week deadline hanging over her head. She put out the lamp and went to bed without asking the goddess anything at all. The question would keep. For the first time since she'd woken up in this body, it wasn't the one keeping her up.